Can a curse kill a person? Do dark rituals, spells, and ancient magic really have the power to destroy the soul and body? For many, it is only a legend. But in Venezuela, in 2020, a 15-year-old girl collapsed after 3 weeks of suffering from a mysterious illness that left doctors helpless and shamans helpless. The last image her father recorded showed a pale-skinned young woman with lifeless eyes, her body jerking like a puppet controlled by an invisible hand. And when the truth was revealed, a chilling confession from a close friend turned this tragedy into one of the most gruesome stories in modern Venezuelan history. Naryeli was born in July 2004 in La Guaira, a coastal port city on the Caribbean Sea and the capital of the Venezuelan state Vargas. She was the youngest daughter of Andrea and Jose Guillén. Her father worked as a dock laborer, while her mother stayed home to care for the family. Naryeli was a cheerful, outgoing girl who excelled at school and sports. She was also active online, sharing photos, short videos, motivational posts, dreaming of one day becoming a successful content creator. La Guaira was not a tourist destination. Its infrastructure had long been in decline. Residents faced frequent outages of water and electricity, problems so severe that local hospitals often struggled to function. Despite the hardships, the community was tight-knit, and people made the best of what they had. Teenagers often gathered for rooftop parties, playing music on old speakers, dancing late into the night. Naryeli was a regular presence at these events, always energetic, always smiling. She studied at a local technical high school and quickly became well known for her athletic talent and lively personality. Friends, both in person and online, saw her as someone who could brighten any room. In August 2019, Naryeli met a young man at one of those rooftop parties. Their connection was instant. He was 19, a few years older than her, but neither seemed to mind. After spending time together in groups, he eventually asked her out. Excited, she confided in her mother, who didn't object to the relationship. Her parents trusted her judgment, knowing she was responsible and mature. At that age, it was normal to experience first love. The young man's identity has never been revealed publicly, and no photos of the two together have surfaced online. Their romance was short, lasting only a few dates. Yet, in a tragic twist, that brief relationship unknowingly set into motion the chain of events that would lead to Naryeli's death. In September 2019, Stephanie Carolina Rodriguez Jimenez, then 19 years old, unexpectedly entered Naryeli's life. Although Stephanie attended a different college, their paths often crossed at local gatherings thanks to a shared circle of friends. She even began showing up at volleyball games at Naryeli's school, cheering enthusiastically for her and her teammates. The two quickly bonded and built a strong friendship. Stephanie messaged Naryeli daily, asking about her life, inviting her to private events and exclusive parties. She had a talent for finding discounted movie tickets and always seemed to know about the latest cultural happenings in town, often gaining access to places others couldn't. She was attractive, confident, and popular on social media. She often shared advice with her younger friends on how to create engaging online content and build a strong online presence. For Naryeli, spending time with someone slightly older made her feel more mature. Stephanie shared stories of her experiences, frequently gave advice, especially about relationships. Stephanie's association with Naryeli, the school's popular volleyball captain, boosted her own social standing, earning her attention from students eager to be part of their circle. By October, Stephanie had rented a small apartment just a few blocks away from the Guillén family home. At the time, no one thought much of it. She explained she wanted to live independently, away from her parents, and that the location was closer to her college. Before long, she was a familiar face in the Guillén household, dropping by almost every day. Stephanie was warm and friendly, often bringing pastries or sweets, sometimes helping with chores. Naryeli's parents grew fond of her, eventually treating her almost like another daughter. For months, Stephanie was rarely apart from Naryeli. Stephanie joined her at parties, supported her at games, helped with her homework, and frequently stayed overnight. Given how quickly their friendship had developed, and the noticeable differences in age and lifestyle, some people wondered what exactly drew them together. Adding to the curiosity, Stephanie displayed a deep fascination with mysticism and spiritual practices. She claimed her grandmother, originally from Cuba, was a powerful spiritual healer with Yoruba roots and African culture. Stephanie often wore unusual charms, which she said protected her from envy and negative forces. One of her most prized possessions was a small red cloth pouch containing stones, dried herbs, bird feathers. She carries it everywhere. She presented herself as a kind of spiritual guide, saying she had inherited ancient wisdom from her ancestors. According to her, she could perform protective rituals, cleanse negative energy, even help people attract love and success. Her apartment reflected this identity: shelves lined with spellbooks, colored candles, saint figurines, papers marked with occult symbols, stones, and ritual tools. To younger friends, Stephanie's mysterious aura gave her an almost guru-like status. She often spoke about human energy, how it could be manipulated for healing and cleansing. When Andrea, Naryeli's mother, learned about Stephanie's spiritual interests, she grew concerned. A devout Catholic, Andrea viewed such practices as dangerous and incompatible with her faith. She even considered forbidding her daughter from spending time with Stephanie. But after speaking with her husband, other relatives, and hearing Naryeli's reassurances, Andrea decided it was likely just harmless curiosity. After all, Stephanie had already become like family. In mid-December 2019, Stephanie suggested something unusual to Naryeli and a few other girls: a cleansing ritual under the full moon. That night, the group went down to the beach carrying candles and small mystical figurines. Stephanie recited incantations in Yoruba, drew symbols and pentagrams in the sand. She lit candles, offered each girl what she called personal protection. When Naryeli returned home at dawn, she was wearing a bracelet woven from red and black threads with tiny beads tied tightly around her wrist. Andrea felt a wave of unease when she saw it. Naryeli reassured her, explaining that Stephanie had given it as a protective charm and told her to never take it off. Still, Andrea couldn't shake her discomfort. The bracelet looked unsettling. That night, once Naryeli was asleep, Andrea carefully cut the thread and removed the charm. The next morning, when Naryeli noticed it was gone, she was surprised but didn't insist. After a quick look around her room, she shrugged it off, assuming it had fallen during the night. On December 23rd, just before Christmas, only days after the ritual, Naryeli and 3 college friends traveled to the capital for one of the country's largest holiday fairs. They spent the day shopping for gifts, enjoying the festive atmosphere before catching the bus home. It was blisteringly hot. The bus was overcrowded. As soon as Naryeli stepped off in Guaira, she collapsed. Friends and strangers rushed to help, offering water, calling for medical aid, and notifying her family. Doctors concluded she had suffered from heat exhaustion and assured everyone there was no serious danger. Naryeli was sent home with instructions to rest and stay hydrated. Her parents were not alarmed. She had always been strong, athletic, rarely sick. The following days passed uneventfully as the family prepared for New Year's. But one thing was strange. Stephanie, who had practically lived at the Guillén home, suddenly disappeared. She stopped visiting and no longer answered calls or messages. Concerned, the family tried repeatedly to reach her but got nothing back. Then, in the early hours of December 29th, Naryeli suddenly fell gravely ill. She vomited violently throughout the night. Terrified, her parents rushed her to the hospital at dawn. Yet again, doctors found nothing alarming. Her temperature was normal, blood pressure steady, test results clear, and heart activity perfectly regular. With no obvious diagnosis, the medical team discharged her, advising the family to monitor her closely and keep her hydrated. But back at home, her condition worsened. Naryeli trembled uncontrollably, was so weak she could barely move, and suffered constant dizziness. She refused food, saying even tiny sips of water made her nauseous. Andrea tried to feed her drops at a time, but almost immediately, she would throw it up. Oddly, she showed no symptoms typical of infection, poisoning, or even a common illness. Her temperature and blood pressure stayed normal. On January 2nd, the family called their physician to the house again. He couldn't identify the illness but was alarmed by how frail she had become, recommending urgent evaluation at a larger hospital. But even after a complete blood panel, prosecute tests, an EKG, and further screenings, doctors found nothing unusual. There were no acute signs, though they still urged the family to seek advanced care in the capital. Meanwhile, Naryeli's decline continued. She could no longer eat. Her mother called multiple hospitals and private clinics in the capital, but every facility turned them down. The staff refused to admit her without a clear diagnosis. Things spiraled quickly. In just 1 week, Naryeli lost more than 11 pounds, a dangerous amount for anyone, but especially for a slender teenager. It was heartbreaking to see her so thin and sick. The family doctor could only shake his head helplessly while her parents grew desperate, unsure how to save their daughter, who seemed to be fading before their eyes. By January 4th, Naryeli could no longer swallow anything at all. She was too weak to get out of bed, her voice reduced to a faint whisper, and then it vanished completely. Soon, she could only respond with nods or small gestures. A few days later, even that became impossible. She started blinking once for yes and twice for no. Her eyes lost focus, staring blankly into nothing. On January 5th, the doctor visited again and confirmed only that she was suffering from severe exhaustion of unknown origin. Another round of tests ruled out infection and showed no acute medical issues. Nearly all her readings were within the normal range, except for a slight drop in glucose. Doctors administered IV fluids to counteract dehydration. Local physicians remained baffled. In desperation, they turned to those who practiced folk healing and spiritual cleansing. On January 6th, 2020, Naryeli's father, Yossi, recorded a short video on his phone. The footage showed her sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, but completely unfocused. Staring into the void, her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Her skin was ghostly pale, and her arms and legs jerked involuntarily, as if pulled by invisible strings. Jose sent the video to a distant relative, Claudio Royas, a spiritual healer known for his ancestral rituals of cleansing and protection. After watching the video, Rojas immediately called the family. He told them their daughter was under a dark spiritual influence, something that was draining her life force. According to him, no doctor would be able to help, and they needed to bring her to his community in Carabaleta right away, so he and his team could perform the necessary rituals. To the desperate parents, his words sounded like a final lifeline. They immediately left with their frail daughter. The next morning reached the medicine man's remote mountain village. The community spiritual center was a wide, single-story hall with a flower-covered altar. Candles burned everywhere as practitioners chanted prayers in a mix of Spanish and African-rooted dialects. Naryeli was laid on a stretcher in front of the altar, where 3 healers led by Rojas checked her pulse and made symbolic gestures over her body. After this initial diagnosis, Rojas declared that a dark force had entered through her breath and was feeding on her life energy. The ritual to expel the darkness would be carried out in 3 stages. The first was fire cleansing. That night, Naryeli remained at the altar, surrounded by dozens of burning candles. She was sprinkled with holy water, herbal infusions, and rum while prayers were recited. Just before dawn, a live white rooster was waved over her body from head to toe before being sacrificed at the altar as part of a symbolic transfer of the illness. The second stage was purification through cold water. Naryeli was carried to a fast-flowing mountain stream believed to hold sacred powers. She was immersed 3 times, then wrapped in blankets and returned to the temple. Her damp body was packed with ice and left in the courtyard until morning. As extreme as it was, the change was noticeable. Her limbs stopped twitching, and her breathing grew calmer. On the 3rd day of the ritual, Naryeli's body was coated in a thick herbal paste from head to toe. A tincture of bitter roots and fermented extracts was prepared. Rojas explained that if she could manage even a single sip, it would prove the cleansing had succeeded. But Naryeli remained unresponsive. Whatever liquid touched her lips simply trickled back out. Still, Rojas insisted the ritual had been completed correctly, that the darkness had been expelled, and the rest was now in higher hands. The family stayed one final night as smoke, prayers, and whispered incantations filled the temple. On January 10th, they returned home with their daughter. While Andrea and Jose fought desperately to save their youngest child, the rest of the world blurred into irrelevance. They barely noticed that Naryeli's best friend, Stephanie, had vanished. It was her siblings who uncovered the unsettling truth. Stephanie had moved out of her apartment overnight, abandoning nearly a full month of rent and all of her belongings. The timing was chilling. She disappeared. The very same day Naryeli stopped drinking even water. No calls, no messages, no explanation. It felt like she had run. On the evening of January 11th, at 7:30 p.m., Naryeli died in her parents' arms. Barely 3 weeks had passed since her first symptoms. The medical report listed the cause of death as pneumonia brought on by extreme exhaustion because it was considered natural. No autopsy was performed. No toxicology tests were ordered. The funeral was small, quiet, and raw with grief. But 3 days later, on January 14th, Stephanie suddenly resurfaced. She reached out to mutual friends, pretending ignorance, asking what had happened to Naryeli. When the news reached Andrea and Jose, their grief boiled into fury. They tracked her down, confronted her face to face, and demanded the truth. Terrified, Stephanie broke. She stammered that she never meant for things to go so far, that she hadn't wanted her friend to die. But then came the confession. She had cursed Naryeli out of jealousy. The boy Naryeli dated the previous summer was the same boy Stephanie secretly wanted. When he chose Naryeli, Stephanie swore revenge. She began befriending her, worming her way into the Gomez household, smiling sweetly while quietly collecting intimate traces of Naryeli's life. A sweat-soaked t-shirt after gym practice, the hairs from her comb, a spoon after lunch, even a blood-stained tissue from a small cut. She gathered it all, took it to an abandoned cemetery, and buried it in a shallow grave. A ritual meant to bind a restless spirit to Naryeli's body. But it didn't stop there. Months later, Stephanie discovered bones unearthed by a flood. She scavenged fragments of decomposed human remains, bone shards, strips of rotting tissue. She ground them into a fine, putrid powder, mixed it with soil from the cemetery, and began slipping it into Naryeli's food and drinks. Slowly, in secret, she was poisoning Naryeli with the dead. When Stephanie admitted this, Andrea and Jose dragged her to the local police station, forcing her to repeat every word. She did, but nothing happened. Venezuelan law does not recognize sorcery or spiritual practices as crimes. Could she have been charged with intentional poisoning? Possibly, but with no autopsy, no toxicology, no forensic evidence. The official cause of death remained natural. The body lay in its grave, untouched. The Gomez family couldn't afford the immense costs of exhumation or private forensic testing in the capital, and so Stephanie was set free, without any punishment. As word of Naryeli's death spread, her story twisted into a modern legend, a haunting tale retold in whispers. 4 theories emerged. The first was spiritual, that Stephanie's curse had worked exactly as intended, a restless spirit tethered to Naryeli until it drained her life away. The second was medical horror. Some suggested she had contracted Kuru, the infamous cannibal's disease once seen in Papua New Guinea. But with its decades-long incubation, this explanation was quickly dismissed. The third was toxicological. Far more plausible was that by secretly ingesting soil and human remains, Naryeli had been exposed to lethal bacteria or neurotoxins that tore through her nervous system, silencing her voice and stealing control of her body. The fourth theory focuses on a psychological cause. Some believe Naryeli's rapid decline stemmed from extreme emotional stress or mental trauma. According to this idea, she may have subconsciously stopped eating and drinking, entering a psychogenic state that led to extreme dehydration and eventually death. Ultimately, the exact cause of what happened to Naryeli was never determined. Naryeli's death remains a wound without closure, a life stolen in shadows, with no justice, no answers, and no peace. Whether she was undone by poison, by her own mind, or by something darker that science cannot name, no one will ever know. What is certain is that her final weeks were marked by suffering beyond comprehension. Today, her story lingers as both a cautionary tale and a ghostly legend, and a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how easily friendship can become the mask for something monstrous. Sometimes kindness is not repaid with gratitude, but with blood. Two teenage girls, Brandy and Liz, simply stopped to help a stranger on the side of the road. But that seemingly innocent moment unleashed a nightmare that would never end. A trip to the video store turned tragic, leaving one fighting desperately for her life, while the other was brutally murdered, her throat slashed so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. So, what really happened to them that fateful night? Our story takes place in Dover, a small town in Tuscarawas County, Ohio. At the turn of the millennium, just over 12,000 people lived there. Dover borders New Philadelphia, the county's administrative center, and sits about 100 kilometers south of Cleveland. In the early morning hours of Thursday, May 25th, 2000, around 1:30 a.m., a weary police officer was driving home after his shift when he noticed a figure stumbling along the roadside. At first, he assumed it was someone leaving a nearby bar, given the unsteady walk, but something felt off, so he decided to stop and check. As he got closer, he realized this wasn't a drunken bar patron. Instead, it was a small, fragile teenage girl. When she spotted the police car, she began screaming and waving frantically. The officer immediately pulled over and saw that she was barefoot, soaking wet, bruised, and terrified. Between sobs, she managed to say she had been in the river. Despite her own dire condition, her first words were about her friend. She was desperate to know if her friend was safe. The officer helped calm her, brought her into the car to warm up, and rushed her to safety. Along the way, he tried to piece together what had happened, but she could barely speak. What he did gather was enough to know that something horrific had occurred. She identified herself as Brandy Hicks, 18 years old. Her best friend, Elizabeth Liz Reiser, 17, was missing. Elizabeth had been born on March 23, 1983, the eldest child and only daughter of her parents, who also had 3 sons. From childhood, Liz had been surrounded by love, and she reflected that love back into the world. She was kind, outgoing, always greeted others with a smile, even strangers. Like other teenage girls, Liz loved Mountain Dew, Dalmatians, and the cartoon Rugrats. She worried about high school dances, her appearance, getting her driver's license, and finishing school. She dreamed of graduating and starting her adult life. Friends and family adored her, even at 17, an age when many teens focus only on themselves. Liz was known for her generosity and constant willingness to help others. Sadly, it was this caring nature that would lead her into danger. While Brandy was found at 1:30 a.m., the Reiser family was awakened a few hours later, between 3:15 a.m. and 3:45 a.m., by a knock on the door. Their 12-year-old son, whose bedroom was closest to the entrance, peeked out the window and saw a police officer standing on the porch. Half asleep, he unlocked the door, only to be asked if Elizabeth was home. Confused, the boy shut the door and ran upstairs to wake his parents. Elizabeth's parents, still groggy, went downstairs to meet the officer. That was when they received the news every parent dreads. Their daughter Liz was missing, and her best friend Brandy had been pulled from the river. At first, Liz's parents thought it had to be some kind of mistake. They knew she was supposed to spend the night at her best friend Brandy's house. The girls had planned a simple slumber party, and to avoid driving home in the dark, Liz told her parents she would stay over. And now, suddenly, the police were saying Liz was missing. How could that be possible? They were stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. Becky, Liz's mother, immediately rushed upstairs to her daughter's bedroom, hoping maybe Liz had come home without telling anyone. But as she climbed the stairs, a deep sense of dread crept in. Her hands and legs trembled uncontrollably. When she reached Liz's room, she peeked inside anyway. The familiar mess was there, clothes scattered, makeup tossed around. Liz was like a whirlwind. She could spend half a day cleaning her room and then wreck it again in minutes. That was just her. But one thing was clear. Liz wasn't there. Becky went back downstairs, where her husband and the officer were waiting. The officer explained that earlier that night, a patrolman had found Brandy, Liz's best friend, wandering on a dark road outside of town. She was soaking wet, covered in blood, and in shock, Brandy told police they had been attacked. She didn't know where Liz was or what had happened to her. Brandy had been rushed to the hospital, but there was no trace of Liz. The officer had come to the Riser's home simply to check if Liz had somehow returned. Liz's disappearance quickly turned into her family's worst nightmare. Normally, her parents didn't allow her to spend the night at friends' houses, but this time was different. Graduation was just around the corner, and they made an exception. Now, Becky couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. Liz wasn't a rebellious teen. Both she and Brandy came from religious families. They went to church, kept close to their families, and weren't the type to sneak into trouble. Becky tried to reassure herself by saying she'd scold Liz when she got home. But in her heart, she knew something was terribly wrong. That night, Liz's parents couldn't sleep. They prayed, paced, and stared out the window, hoping Liz might appear around the corner. Her father sat on the couch with his Bible, flipping to random passages in an attempt to steady his heart. Her mother kept moving from window to window, scanning the horizon for her daughter's familiar figure. Hours passed. The phone never rang. Liz never came home. By dawn, their fragile hope began to collapse. Around 6:00 a.m., they couldn't take it anymore. They drove to the hospital where Brandy had been taken, desperate for answers. In the waiting room, they found Brandy's family already there, sitting in heavy silence. And then, like a sudden flash, Liz's father was struck with a painful certainty. Deep down, he knew his daughter was gone. The night before, while reading his Bible, he had landed on a verse from Matthew. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." At the time, he tried to push the thought away. But now, sitting in that waiting room, his worst fear solidified into grim conviction. His daughter was never coming home. At that moment, no one yet knew exactly what had happened to Liz. But the Riser's worst fears were confirmed all too soon. Police officers arrived at the hospital and quietly informed them that a body matching Liz's description had been found. They listed the clothing items discovered at the scene. With trembling hands, Liz's parents showed the officers a photo of their daughter. Their nightmare had become reality. Liz was dead. Now, they faced the unbearable task of going home to tell their 3 sons that their big sister would never return. So, what really happened that night? According to Brandy, it was just a normal Wednesday evening. Liz and she had been looking forward to their sleepover all day. Finals and graduation were just around the corner. They were buzzing with excitement. A new chapter of their lives was about to begin. They wanted to savor every moment of their last days. As high school girls, the plan was simple: stay up late, talk about the future, and watch a couple of fun movies. Around 9:30 p.m., the girls drove to a video rental store in a nearby shopping plaza. They browsed the shelves together, chatting about a recent church choir concert they'd both attended. After some time, they settled on a few movies, laughed their way through the aisles, and finally headed back to the car. That's when a young man, about 25 years old, approached them. He wore glasses, a baseball cap pulled low, and had dark hair curling out at the sides. He looked ordinary, harmless. Even, he asked politely if they could give him a ride home. They hesitated. He was a stranger, after all. But sensing their doubt, the man assured them it was just a short drive, 10 minutes at most. He even paid them $20 for gas. Then he mentioned his wife and small children, saying he was desperate to get home before his kids went to bed. That detail made Brandy and Liz let their guard down. A family man with little kids, he couldn't possibly mean them any harm. Besides, in a small town like New Philadelphia, you tended to trust people. After a brief exchange, they made a fateful decision. Brandy slid behind the wheel, Liz in the passenger seat, and the man got into the back. At first, everything seemed fine. But as the minutes ticked by, they realized they'd been driving far longer than 10 minutes. Houses grew sparse, and the road stretched into empty countryside. Unease spread quickly. Brandy finally asked how much farther they had to go. The man calmly insisted they were almost there. But 2 minutes passed, then 5, and still there was nothing. Brandy pulled the car over, her voice tense. She told the man he'd have to walk the rest of the way. They needed to go home. But the situation turned dark in an instant. Instead of getting out, the stranger pulled a gun. He ordered them to keep driving. Brandy and Liz exchanged terrified glances. Brandy gripped the wheel. Liz sat frozen. And the man's calm tone gave way to commands. He demanded money, but they had none. He didn't seem satisfied. Instead, he directed Brandy to drive out to a remote field miles from town, guiding her like he knew the place well. At one point, as they climbed a hill, he told her to slow down because the road would be rough. It was clear this was his plan all along. Once they stopped in the secluded area, the man ordered both girls to remove their sneaker laces. He forced Brandy to tie Liz's hands behind her back. Then he used the other laces to bind Brandy tightly to the steering wheel, cinching the knot so cruelly that she couldn't move her fingers. Brandy looked at Liz, tears streaming down her face. She whispered apologies, blaming herself for what was happening. Liz, crying too, told her not to be sorry, that it wasn't her fault. Neither of them could fully grasp the danger they were in. They only knew their lives had spiraled into a nightmare. Seconds later, the man yanked open the passenger door and ordered Liz to get out. Brandy whispered that they would see each other soon. She watched helplessly as her best friend, hands bound, was led away into the darkness. Brandy was left tied to the steering wheel, alone in the dark. Panic set in. Liz had just been led away by a stranger with a weapon, and she had no idea what fate awaited her. Every passing second felt like an eternity. In the clearing, Liz was forced to her knees. The man lit a cigarette and stood there, silent, as though weighing his options. In truth, he had only planned to rob the two girls. He hadn't set out with murder on his mind. But when he discovered they had no money, things spiraled out of control. He considered letting Liz go, even thought about giving her directions back to town. But then the reality struck him. She'd seen his face. She could identify him. Letting her walk away wasn't an option anymore. Suddenly, he pulled out a small, curved knife. Pretending he was about to cut her free, he leaned closer. Instead, he slashed her throat. Once, twice, 3 times. The cuts were so deep they nearly severed her head. He then stabbed her repeatedly in the head and back until the knife itself snapped. Liz had no chance of survival. When the man returned to the car, Brandy's heart sank. He was alone. Her voice cracked as she asked where Liz was. But he ignored the question. Instead, he fumbled with the knots he himself had tied, freed her from the steering wheel, and shoved her up the hill. Brandy's legs trembled so violently she thought she might collapse. She was only 18 years old, yet she felt the end of her life closing in. Thoughts of her parents and family rushed through her mind. Would they ever find her body? Would they blame her for trusting a stranger? At the top of the hill, the path split in 2 directions. The man forced her to the right. Brandy, glancing quickly to the left, caught a glimpse of something in the grass. But before her brain could register what it was, the man grabbed her face and turned it away. What she had unknowingly seen was Liz's mutilated body. For one fleeting moment, she still clung to hope that Liz had escaped. They didn't walk far before he turned back toward the car, as though undecided about what to do with her. He shoved Brandy into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. Then, he ordered her to remove her socks. He pulled them over his hands like gloves, determined not to leave fingerprints. The drive that followed was suffocatingly silent until he broke it. He said, he killed her friend, almost like making small talk. Brandy Frozze, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stared out the windshield, held back her tears, and the scream rising in her chest. Moments later, he shifted his tone, saying he had only been joking. He just wanted to scare her. He claimed Liz was fine, that he had given her directions back to town and let her go. Exhausted and terrified, Brandy clung to that story, desperately wanting to believe it. A feeling of relief flooded through her. Though she was still worried, she worried about her own fate. He parked near some railroad tracks and ordered her out of the car. They walked side by side. Brandy was terrified, crying and in pain, while the guy just talked to her and asked questions as if nothing terrible had happened. He asked about school, college plans, whether she had a boyfriend, what her parents were like. His tone was eerily casual, as if they were chatting on a normal evening stroll. Though Brandy didn't want to discuss her personal life with him, she kept the conversation going, hoping he would take a liking to her and not harm her. After some time, they came across an abandoned freight train car sitting on a siding. He forced Brandy inside. He stripped her of her cheap jewelry and coldly offered her a chance to earn her life. If she wanted to survive, she had to undress. Terrified and unsure what else he might do, Brandy reluctantly obeyed. He unzipped his pants and tried several times to abuse her. Thankfully, he failed, but the attempts alone left Brandy devastated, humiliated, and broken. To her, it felt like hours of torment. His touch was repulsive, and the violation etched deep scars on her spirit. Frustrated by his failure, he finally threw her clothes back at her and barked at her to get dressed. Shaking, Brandy pulled on her pants and sweater, curled up on the filthy floor of the train car, and wished she could disappear. But there was no mercy. He yanked her back to her feet and forced her out once again. Their path eventually led to a railroad bridge spanning the Tuscarawas River in New Philadelphia. There, he ordered Brandy to kneel and face the water. Standing behind her, he looped one of the sneaker laces he had taken earlier around her neck and began to strangle her. Her world went black. One moment she was gasping for air, and the next, nothing. When Brandy came to, she realized she was lying on the bridge. He stood nearby, staring down at the river. Unaware she had regained consciousness. Summoning her courage, she lay still, pretending to be dead. But he wasn't convinced. He jabbed her back with his fist, then kicked her body, testing for signs of life. In the darkness, Brandy managed to remain limp. Yet when a particularly strong blow made her moan involuntarily, the man knew she was still alive. Furious, he straddled her, tried to twist her neck, then slammed her head against the rails. Finally, he lifted her up and hurled her off the bridge. Fate intervened. Her foot snagged between the metal and wooden structure, leaving her dangling upside down over the water. He forced her loose, and she plunged headfirst 9 meters into the Tuscarawas. Miraculously, she landed among floating logs and debris that spared her from a fatal blow. Barely conscious, she let the current carry her until she clung to a drifting log, playing dead once more. She held her breath as she spotted the glow of his cigarette above. He paced the bridge, peering down into the darkness, tossing rocks to test if she was alive. Brandy stayed motionless until, at last, he left. When she was certain the coast was clear, she began the agonizing crawl to shore. The icy water, the pain from her injuries, and sheer exhaustion made every movement unbearable. Still, she pressed on. Once on land, another wave of fear struck her. What if he was still nearby? Only pretending to leave disoriented, she stumbled onto a road and tried flagging down passing cars. But drivers ignored the disheveled, bleeding teenager. Then, By a twist of fate, a police officer finishing his shift noticed her. He pulled over and helped the pale, trembling girl into his car. Safe at last. Brandy broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She couldn't form a coherent story. Her words tumbled out, mostly about her friend Liz. Later, when she regained her strength, she told investigators everything. Officers were stunned. A nightmarish attack on two innocent schoolgirls seemed almost unimaginable. But there was no time to waste. They still had to find Liz. Brandy, through her tears, recalled a fleeting glimpse of something on the other path. She wasn't certain, but feared deep down it might have been Liz. Police immediately dismissed the idea that Liz had been released. They were convinced that what Brandy had glimpsed on the path was her friend. Acting quickly, officers rushed to the location Brandy described. There was still a slim chance Liz was alive, perhaps unconscious, and in need of urgent medical care. But even if she had already passed, they needed to find her body. Local law enforcement joined forces with the Ohio State Police. At first light, a search party combed the area, flashlights sweeping across bushes and uneven ground. Before long, two officers stumbled upon a mound of earth. At first, they didn't recognize it as a body. But when they looked closer, their fears were confirmed. It was Elizabeth Liz Reiser. The gruesome wounds made it obvious she was dead. Now the investigation had two crime scenes: the clearing where Liz's body lay, and the railroad bridge where Brandy had miraculously survived. Detectives had little to go on. Brandy provided a description of her attacker, a stocky young man, around 25, about 175 centimeters tall, dark curly hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a baseball cap. It was vague, matching countless young men, and gave investigators no clear lead. Their first theory was that the killer was local, or at least knew the area well. Still, that wasn't enough. The case could have dragged on for months. But then came a break. A woman called the police with a chilling tip. Her son had confessed to killing someone. She had learned about it through a relative named Jeff Mullenix. Her son was 27-year-old Matthew Vaca. Investigators immediately sought out Jeff. He recounted a disturbing encounter early in the morning of May 25th. The same night, Brandy encountered a police officer. Someone knocked at his door. It was Matthew, clearly agitated, insisting Jeff come with him. They drove in silence for a while before Jeff finally asked why he had been dragged out so early. After a moment of silence, Matthew blurted out that he had stabbed a girl to death. Jeff thought it was a sick joke, until Matthew drove him to the hilltop and showed him Liz's body. He even asked Jeff to help locate the broken blade of his knife, fearing it carried his fingerprints. Together, they found the fragment, placed it along with his blood-stained clothes in a bag, and threw it into the river. Once Jeff relayed this horrifying story, detectives had what they needed. A warrant was issued, and the next day, Matthew Vaca was arrested. Brandy's description lined up perfectly with his appearance. The news of the brutal murder and attempted murder spread quickly through the small town, shaking the entire community. It was unthinkable. Two teenage girls, just out for a pajama party and a video rental, suddenly caught in the grip of violence. One was gone forever. The other barely survived. At their school, grief counselors were brought in to support students reeling from the loss. A memorial for Liz and Brandy was set up at the flagpole, a solemn reminder of the tragedy. What made the crime even more horrifying was its randomness. If Brandy and Liz could have turned the stranger away, someone else could have accidentally encountered him that night. The second shock came when the killer's identity was revealed. Not a drifter, not an outsider, but a neighbor, a man who had been living among them all along. Matthew Vaca was a husband and father of 3 young children. Outwardly, he looked like an ordinary family man. But behind closed doors, he carried a violent past. His criminal record stretched long, threatening his stepfather, forging documents, banned substance abuse, even holding a knife and shotgun to his wife's throat. At the time of the attack, he was on probation for theft and forgery. However, no one had realized just how dangerous he truly was. The investigators started searching for evidence to prove Matthew Vaca's guilt, but they didn't need to. After his arrest, Matthew confessed to almost everything. He admitted he had no clear reason for attacking Brandy and Liz. At first, he only planned to rob them when he asked for a favor. But when Liz told him to get out of the car, a dark thought crossed his mind. He wanted to know what it felt like to take another person's life. His lawyer later claimed it was a reckless, impulsive act from a man who had been on a 2-day drinking binge and had lost control of his emotions. Matthew Vaca was charged with 11 counts: murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, abused assault, tampering with evidence, and desecration of a corpse. While awaiting trial, he was held without bail. The prosecution pushed for the death penalty, but Matthew accepted a plea deal that spared him from that outcome. Surprisingly, the families of the victims opposed the death penalty, Liz's parent, as well as Brandy. They believed forgiveness was the right path. They argued that taking a life was not their choice to make, only God's. At sentencing, Matthew was forced to listen as those whose lives he had shattered spoke directly to him. The most emotional statement came from Brandy, who faced her abductor in court and spoke not only for herself, but also for her best friend whose life he had stolen. Her courage was remarkable. She testified in detail about the attack. Matthew attempted to read a statement of his own, but he was so nervous, stuttered so badly that his attorney had to read it for him. In it, he said he was ready to accept responsibility and consequences, and he would pray for the families of the victims. The prosecutor, however, made it clear that she believed Matthew deserved the death penalty. She told him directly that, if it were up to her, he would be executed. But she added that even death would be too merciful. Instead, she said, prison would bring him the punishment he truly deserved: a lifetime of fear, humiliation, and pain. Her voice was filled with emotion, perhaps because she, too, was a mother. In the end, the judge sentenced Matthew Vaca to life in prison, plus additional terms for the other charges. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The judge noted that Matthew was an ongoing danger to society, pointing out that if his knife hadn't broken on Liz's body, Brandy likely would not have survived. Forgiveness became the cornerstone of Liz's family's healing process. Her mother, Becky, even wrote a book about their journey. Together with her husband, they now hold seminars about their daughter's death and the power of forgiveness. They even visited Matthew in prison, prayed with him, and convinced him not to take his own life. The prosecutor's words turned out to be true. Prison was brutal. Only behind bars did Matthew finally come to understand the magnitude of his crime. He told Liz's parents he did not deserve to live after what he had done. As for Brandy, she focused on reclaiming her happiness and moving forward. She chose to live privately, away from media attention. Today, she still lives in her hometown of New Philadelphia, works as a photographer, has built a beautiful life with her husband and 3 children. Matthew Vaca, once consumed by a twisted curiosity to take a life, now spends his remaining days in prison, trapped in regret and forced to live with the weight of what he did. A tragedy that seemed to have been preordained from birth. Carla Figueroa, a young girl from La Pampa, Argentina, had been traumatized since she was 8 months old, when her own father murdered her mother right before her eyes. One might have thought that cruel fate had been sealed in the past, but many years later, history repeated itself in the most horrifying way. On the night of December 10, 2011, in a small bedroom, Marcelo Tomaselli stabbed Carla repeatedly in the chest, each cold blow piercing through her desperate screams. Before their small 5-year-old son, the tragedy unfolded again. A man killed his wife, and their child became a powerless witness to that horrifying scene. How could an 18-year-old girl, who had just found the courage to denounce her abuser and be pushed back into his arms, and pay with her life? And why did Argentine law at the time allow it to happen? Stay tuned until the end of the video to discover the whole haunting truth behind this shocking case. In the early 1990 seconds, in the quiet city of General Pico, La Pampa, Argentina, a girl named Carla Figueroa was born. Her life should have begun with promise, but tragedy struck almost immediately. Carla was the daughter of Cristina, who had already faced the challenges of a previous marriage and was raising an older daughter, Soledad Reynoso. When Carla was only 8 months old, her father killed her mother, an event she witnessed, though she could not understand. From then on, everything changed. With her mother gone and her father absent, Carla was taken in by Soledad, who was still a teenager. Despite her youth, Soledad became both sister and guardian. During the years she lived with Soledad, Carla found some peace and stability. When Soledad later had a daughter, Paola Tarpin, Carla gained not just a niece, but someone who felt like a sister. They grew up together, sharing laughter, secrets, and dreams. Carla was like many young women her age. She loved music, dancing, and time with friends and family. Though marked by early trauma, she carried a hopeful spirit. She longed for happiness and dreamed of building a family of her own. In 2005, a friend introduced Carla to Marcelo Tomaselli, 6 years her senior. At 14, Carla found him charming and saw in him the stability and affection she had always wanted. At first, their relationship felt like a fairy tale, but the illusion faded quickly. Marcelo's jealousy, possessiveness, and addictions emerged. His temper escalated, and verbal abuse turned into physical violence. For a time, Carla lived with him in his mother, Rosana's home. After Rosana separated from her husband, Carla tried desperately to keep the relationship together, perhaps haunted by her mother's fate and determined to preserve the little family she had. Friends and neighbors would later describe their bond as a dangerous obsession, not love. In 2008, Carla gave birth to their son, Valentin. For a moment, it seemed like a fresh start. But Marcelo did not change. He remained violent, unstable, and neglectful as a father. Each time Carla tried to leave, he begged forgiveness, promised to change, or threatened self-harm. Years of this cycle exhausted her. By March 2011, Carla reached her limit and decided to leave for good. She wanted safety for herself and, above all, for her son. After a heated argument, she reminded Marcelo that she had never asked him for financial support. Not once, despite his neglect. She even allowed his family, including Rosana, to stay near Valentin. Instead of calming him, her words enraged him. That day, when Carla tried to leave, Marcelo snapped. He struck her and forced her onto her motorcycle, threatening her as she drove a short distance. He ordered her to stop on a deserted road, armed and, by his later admission, high on drugs. He was determined to control her. With no escape, he led her to an isolated area and forced her to undress. He assaulted her. When it ended, he lit a cigarette and watched her as she tried to dress. Then he climbed over her again and whispered chilling words. He mocked the tragedy of her mother's death, implying he would repeat it. Carla understood the threat all too well. Terrified and trembling, she begged for her life, her pleas swallowed by the night. At last, Marcelo left Carla in that isolated spot, as if the nightmare had ended. Desperate for control, she asked him for the weapon, hoping to take it away. He refused. Without warning, he threw her into a drainage ditch and ordered her back onto the motorcycle. The ride back was tense. Marcelo grew more erratic with every mile. He begged her repeatedly not to tell anyone what had happened. Carla tried to keep him calm, thinking only of one thing: finding a way to get him off the motorcycle so she could escape and return to her son. She finally managed to drop him at Rosana's house, convincing him to go inside and take a bath. As soon as she got the chance, Carla ran to Rosana to tell her what had happened. She poured out the horror she had just experienced. Still shaking, she ran straight to her sister Soledad's house to confide in her. Together, they went to the local police to file a formal complaint. Authorities ordered a medical examination and confirmed the attack. Carla had just turned 18. She had finally spoken up. Marcelo was arrested and jailed. To protect herself and her child, Carla and Soledad decided to make the case public. They went to a local television station. Carla appeared with her back to the camera, her face hidden, determined to speak while protecting her identity and shielding little Valentine. On screen, her fear was evident. She warned that if anything happened to her, Marcelo would be responsible. Within 2 weeks, things had calmed down. Carla tried to rebuild her days, drawing strength from her son and the steadfast support of her sister and family. But the trauma remained. Anxiety weighed heavily on her. Another struggle also grew: money. Despite her efforts, she couldn't find steady work, and the pressure of raising a child alone intensified. During this difficult time, Rosanna, Marcelo's mother, turned to Carla. She gave Carla small amounts of money to help with Valentine and tried to maintain a bond with her grandson. During those conversations, Rosanna mentioned a legal option then available in Argentina called avenimiento, a controversial mechanism that allows abusers and victims to reconcile with the possibility of dropping charges if both agree. For Carla, this became a turning point. She said Marcelo begged for forgiveness, trapped by fear, financial hardship, and emotional manipulation. Carla made a decision that shocked her family. She agreed to forgive him. Her sister Soledad was devastated. Soledad had always opposed any reconciliation, convinced that giving Marcelo another chance would put Carla in greater danger. But Carla, without telling her family, signed the avenimiento. That was only the first step. The final word rested with the courts. The case went before 3 magistrates and the prosecution. Their initial decision was clear. They rejected the agreement, ruling that Carla could not give free and informed consent after what she had suffered. Marcelo's lawyer appealed, and the case went to a higher court. In a split decision, 4 judges opposed the appeal, but 2 supported Marcelo. Those 2 opinions prevailed, and against expectations, the court authorized the avenimiento. The outcome stunned many. Critics argued the judges ignored Carla's long history of violence. From witnessing her mother's murder by her father as a baby to enduring Marcelo's abuse as a teenager, how could anyone claim her choice was truly free? As part of the agreement, Marcelo accepted a restraining order and promised to undergo psychological and psychiatric treatment for his addictions and violent behavior. On paper, it looked like a path to rehabilitation. In reality, none of it happened. The promises vanished quickly. Weeks later, after Carla's forgiveness was formalized, she and Marcelo were legally married at the civil registry. Those close to Carla believed the marriage stemmed not from love, but from immense pressure and fear. Regardless, the law recognized their union, and Marcelo regained his freedom. On December 2, 2011, Marcelo was released from prison. He returned to live with his mother, Rosanna, who gave him and his partner, Carla, a room in her home so they could stay there with their child, little Valentine. In the early hours of Saturday, December 10, Rosanna came home shortly after 1 a.m. She checked and found Marcelo and Carla apparently asleep. Relieved, she removed her makeup and sat down to watch television. Less than an hour later, Marcelo got up, asked his mother to watch Valentine, and took Carla out to the garden. They later came back inside. Rosanna heard them in the kitchen, heating water to make an infusion. Shortly after, they went outside again. Around 4:30 a.m., Rosanna was jolted awake by Valentine's desperate cries echoing through the house. Sensing something was terribly wrong, she panicked. She pounded on the door, calling for Marcelo, but got no answer. She felt, without knowing why, that violence was unfolding behind that door. Desperate, she kicked it repeatedly until she fractured her hip. When Marcelo finally opened the door, the room was dark. He turned on the light. Carla was barely standing, weak and pleading silently for help. Reaching her arms toward Rosanna, paralyzed by pain and shock, Rosanna couldn't intervene. As Valentine cries in the corner, Marcelo attacks again, stabbing Carla repeatedly until she dies. right in front of her son and Rosana. Horrified, Rosana grabbed Valentin and ran into the kitchen. Realizing she was not safe, she barricaded herself and the child in another room. Marcelo soon approached, but instead of attacking, he spoke calmly. He told his mother to stay calm, said it was over, and even asked her for a kiss. His clothes and hands were covered in blood, yet he seemed disturbingly serene, at times softly singing that his heart finally felt free. Terrified, Rosana managed to call the police. When police arrived, they found Marcelo holding his son Valentin, his eyes glazed over. Nearby, Rosana cried out, telling them what had happened. That morning, forensic teams removed Carla's body. She had multiple stab wounds, especially to the neck and chest, leaving no doubt about Marcelo's intent. On December 13, 2011, a judge ordered Marcelo's preventive detention. But the tragedy had already occurred. The community was outraged. Neighbors gathered outside Rosana's home, shouting threats and blaming the family for encouraging Carla and Marcelo to make up. Many demanded revenge. Rosana defended herself, insisting she wasn't responsible and claiming Carla had returned because she still loved Marcelo. Her other son, Walter, expressed shame, admitting that he and Rosana had asked Carla to help Marcelo avoid prison for the earlier assault. Custody of Valentin was given to Carla's devoted sister, Soledad. The boy moved in with her. At night, he would wake, crying for his mother. Grief consumed Carla's family. At the funeral, Soledad breaks down, apologizing to her sister Carla for not being there during her final hours, in a regret she knows she will never get over. Meanwhile, in the prison where Marcelo awaited judgment, another chapter was beginning. Marcelo's mother, Rosana, told reporters she no longer wanted to see her son. After witnessing his cruelty, she said she felt nothing for him. Marcelo, meanwhile, appeared disturbingly detached from his actions, giving a local interview as if he were the victim. He blamed Carla, twisting the facts, and even claimed he still loved her. Most chillingly, he admitted that if he saw her again, he would kill her again. The trial began on June 18, 2012. Marcelo Tomaselli was charged with aggravated murder for the relationship in which he killed his wife, Carla Figueroa. On the first day, he pleaded guilty, but tried to lessen his responsibility by claiming he remembered nothing from that night. His mother testified against him, describing what she saw in the early hours after the crime: his face swollen, distorted, and wild, with bulging eyes. The defense argued Marcelo acted during a violent emotional outburst, supposedly triggered by Carla confessing infidelity and suggesting their son, Valentin, wasn't biologically his. They claimed he suffered temporary amnesia and woke up at the police station without knowing why he was there. Forensic experts dismantled this narrative. There was no medical evidence of amnesia, despite attempts to reduce the charges. The truth stood. On June 28, 2012, the court unanimously found Marcelo Tomaselli guilty of aggravated murder, violating his parole conditions, and sentenced him to life in prison. Outside the courtroom, another scandal erupted. Marcelo had previously been released under the avenimiento law, sparking national outrage. Residents are demanding to know how a convicted abuser could be released on the condition that his victim, Carla, reconcile with him, only to have her killed. Under pressure from human rights and women's organizations, Congress took action. Argentina eliminated the figure of avenimiento from its penal code, ensuring no victim would again be pressured to reconcile with their aggressor in exchange for their freedom. Meanwhile, Marcelo tried to build a life in prison. He started another relationship and fathered a daughter. But after new threats against the child's mother, the courts banned all visits for Valentin, the boy who witnessed the unimaginable. The road ahead was long and painful. He was raised with love by his aunt, Soledad, who treated him as her own son. Reporters who met him years later said he would wake at night crying for his mother. In 2019, 8 years after the case, he was finally allowed to change his last name. The court allowed Soledad and her husband to fully adopt Valentin, giving him a new legal identity. Soledad shared the news with relief, saying her nephew was becoming a kind, intelligent, and caring young man. Despite his painful past, she confirmed that Valentin had no connection to his younger half-sister, Marcelo's daughter, who was in prison, and that his heart was still with his mother, Carla. Marcelo's family also suffered the consequences. Neighbors accused them of complicity and even threatened violence. Rosina, who had once fought for her son's release, now lived with the unbearable reality that she had helped set in motion the events that led to Carla's death. Carla Figueroa's murder shocked Argentina. It was not only the story of a young woman killed by a violent partner, but also a chilling echo of her own mother's fate years earlier. Both women were killed by men they once loved, and both were murdered in front of their children. Carla's case forced the nation to confront a system that had failed her. The avenimiento law was abolished, but for Carla's family, the change came too late. Today, Valentin continues to grow under Soledad's care, surrounded by love and protection. Yet the memory of that December night and of the mother he lost will stay with him forever. On the morning of August 29, 2023, Columbus, the peaceful capital of Ohio, was suddenly plunged into a chilling mystery. Shannon Hyatt, 29 years old, a woman of principle and always on time, suddenly disappeared as if she had melted into thin air. The car was still in the yard, the coffee cup was still on the table, the phone was still charging, but she had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of forced entry, no noisy, no witnesses, no message left. The house was eerily clean, as if someone had erased every scrap of time that had passed during the night. From here, all suspicions gradually turned toward a name that Shannon had once resolutely left behind. Chance Donahoe. How did she disappear? Why did no one hear a sound? And most importantly, what happened in that seemingly perfect house before her body was found in a metal barrel, hidden in an abandoned industrial park, more than 40 kilometers from the city? Columbus, the capital of Ohio, is generally a calm city with low violent crime. But August 29, 2023, was an exception. That morning, Shannon Hyatt was late for her 8 a.m. shift. She almost never ran late, and when she did, she warned people ahead of time. This time, she didn't. By 9 o'clock, her absence seemed suspicious. Co-workers called her, but their calls went to voicemail. By 10 a.m., concerns were growing, and a co-worker contacted Shannon's sister, Lana. However, Lana also couldn't reach her. Lana drove home to visit Shannon. When she arrived, she found Shannon's car still parked in the driveway, as if Shannon had never left for work. She knocked, rang the bell, and called out Shannon's name. No response. Lana informed Shannon's managers, then requested a welfare check from law enforcement. When Columbus police arrived, they saw nothing immediately alarming. Still, Shannon's silence was out of character. Family members confirmed they hadn't received her usual morning call. With worry mounting, police decided around 3 p.m. to force entry. Inside, the house was quiet and tidy, no signs of a struggle or a break-in. A mug of unfinished coffee sat on the kitchen table. The only thing that disappeared was the owner of the house, Shannon. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. No one reported anything unusual that morning or the night before. One neighbor did recall a dark car parked near the house late the previous evening, but couldn't remember the make, model, or license plate. She only noticed it because it seemed out of place. There was no noise or disturbance. A search of 29-year-old Shannon Hyatt's home turned up almost nothing. The only odd detail was an open blind near the back window, but it yielded no useful evidence. Investigators decided to proceed with a forensic sweep, collecting fingerprints, DNA, and using luminol to detect latent blood, suspecting that if something had happened, only microscopic traces might remain. At the same time, detective reviewed Shannon's background. There were no reports of domestic violence, no restraining orders, and no known enemies. But her sister, Lana, it mentioned a troubling ex-boyfriend, Chance Donahoe. According to friends, Chance had continued to stalk Shannon even though they had broken up nearly a year earlier. Their relationship lasted less than a month, yet he was described as manipulative and controlling. Police checked Chance's record. He had no serious offenses, just a few traffic tickets, and no history of violence. Although the kidnapping or murder theory seemed plausible, the lack of clues kept them focused on him. Chance, 27, lived about 40 kilometers away in Powell. Shannon's family could not identify anyone else who seemed suspicious. By 6:30 a.m. the next day, almost 24 hours after Shannon was reported missing, forensic specialists finished the luminol sweep. They found no obvious signs of violence. That, too, raised suspicion. The apartment appeared meticulously cleaned. The only potential trace was a faint, smeared mark near the kitchen's back door that resembled diluted blood. It was too small to confirm an assault or struggle, leaving investigators with no clear understanding of what happened to Shannon. Detectives considered a more unsettling possibility than kidnapping. The home was extremely clean. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle, and Shannon was missing. This suggested that the person responsible had deliberately erased all evidence and was highly skilled at it. Forensic scientists collected the only detectable traces of blood in the home and requested an expedited DNA test. With that done, detectives resumed canvassing the neighborhood, focusing on the early morning hours of August 29 and searching for nearby surveillance cameras on Berkeley Road. There was little video coverage in the area. In the affluent southern part of the city, crime was rare. So few residents installed cameras. Detectives expanded the search radius to include footage from nearby intersections and parking lots within a few kilometers of Shannon's home. Eventually, they spotted a dark sedan about a block from her house. At 2:47 a.m., it drove toward her street. At 4:19 a.m., the same car was seen returning along a similar route. Convinced the forensics team had missed something important, the lead detective ordered another search of the home. This time, they examined potential entry points more closely and found a faint scratch on the rear door lock. An expert later confirmed the lock mechanism could have been compromised by someone skilled, likely a professional. Shannon's phone, meanwhile, was still on the kitchen table. They discovered a suspicious outgoing call and a text sent at 9:38 p.m. A review of Shannon's browser history revealed worrying searches. She had been researching home security, including higher security replacement locks and exterior cameras. Her concern had translated into action. A week before she disappeared, she had changed the locks but hadn't yet installed cameras. Police also found several blocked numbers on her phone, which were traced to her ex, Chance Donahoe. As Chance's name surfaced repeatedly, detectives focused on him. When Shannon's close friend returned to town, she immediately contacted the police, reporting that Shannon had become increasingly afraid of Chance in recent months. Although she hadn't filed a domestic violence report or sought a restraining order, she believed Chance was stalking her. Despite the breakup and living in another city, he kept showing up where Shannon was, at her workplace and elsewhere. Trying to see her, she repeatedly blocked his numbers and removed him from social media. She also asked close friends not to share her whereabouts with anyone. Suspicion toward Chance grew, but investigators still lacked physical evidence and were awaiting the blood test results. Weeks passed. Detectives reclassified the case as a possible homicide to broaden their legal options. They set out to map Chance's movements on the night of August 28 to 29, reviewing camera footage, cell phone data, and card transactions. By the third day, they were focused on the location data from Chance's phone. Records showed that at 2:43 a.m., his phone connected to a cell tower near Shannon's home and stayed in that area until 4:10 a.m. With this information, detectives obtained a search warrant for Chance's residence to seize clothing, weapons, and electronic devices that might link him to Shannon's home. Inside, the house appeared clean, but in the backyard, they found black pants, a dark sweatshirt, and a pair of work boots hidden and tied inside a garbage bag. The items were still damp, as if freshly washed, and showed no visible blood. All were sent for forensic examination. Chance's shoes were thoroughly examined, and his footprints were recorded. Investigators plan to compare his tread pattern with a small footprint found on Shannon's property. When contacted, Chance was cooperative with law enforcement and said he had not seen or spoken to her in several months. He admitted he struggled to accept the breakup for a while, but claimed he had since calmed down. He stated that he was at home the entire night Shannon disappeared. When told about movements recorded from his mobile phone, he seemed confused and insisted there must be a mistake. Chance remained calm during his interview with detectives and appeared credible. With no clear leads, investigators continued searching for evidence. That evening, the examination of clothing seized from Chance was completed. Microscopic blood spatter belonging to Shannon was found on the clothing. Up to this point, the police have very little evidence, and most of it is circumstantial. Although it points to Chance, they needed to determine what had happened to Shannon, and they assumed she was likely dead. The next step was to find her body. A large-scale search operation began, focusing on the route Chance took the night Shannon disappeared. Investigators identified a time gap in the timeline. At 4:25 a.m., Chance exited the interstate, where cameras may have captured him. He did not reappear on cameras until about 6 o'clock a.m. The most plausible way he could have avoided detection was by turning onto a dirt road leading into a wooded area. Much of this route passed through locations suitable for disposing of a body. Search teams combed ravines and streams. Specialists with cadaver dogs were brought in. They examined abandoned structures, searched streams, collected fabric fragments, and looked for any possible sources of DNA and blood. Simultaneously, police obtained a search warrant for Chance's car. It was evident the vehicle had been thoroughly cleaned. Despite this, microscopic soil particles were found in the trunk carpet. Analysis showed the soil matched samples from the wooded area along his route. That area, near the town where Chance lived, was searched intensively. Investigators also found several hairs under the trunk lining that matched Shannon's. Surveillance footage then showed the exact off-ramp Chance used to leave the highway for the backcountry. This narrowed the search area, but not enough to pinpoint a precise location. Data from Chance's computer and phone provided more leads. He had researched cleaning car interiors, disposing of biological material, and routes through the wooded area between Columbus and his hometown of Powell. He had been searching these topics in the days before Shannon's disappearance, suggesting premeditation. The next day, investigators learned that Chance's phone had connected to a cell tower near a private property not far from Mountain Creek. There was an abandoned, fenced industrial yard there, with multiple breaches in the fence. Police arrived to search the site on the 5th day of the operation, again using cadaver dogs. Among the deteriorating buildings and warehouses, a large metal container drew the dogs' attention. The dogs alerted at the container. Inside, officers found trash and carefully sorted through it until they discovered a tarpaulin containing human remains. The remains were sent immediately to the forensic lab for identification and autopsy. A preliminary assessment indicated the body was that of a young woman. No personal items were found that could confirm her identity. Samples were collected, and forensic teams continued processing the scene, gathering fibers and soil for comparison with evidence from Chance's trunk. They also found shoe prints that, upon testing, matched a pair of shoes seized from Chance's home. The remains were officially identified through dental records. Investigators confirmed the victim was Shannon Hyatt, who was missing. She died from multiple stab wounds to the upper body and neck, consistent with a large serrated knife, which was never found. Defensive wounds were present on her hands. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 3 o'clock a.m. On August 29, matching the previously established timeline, toxicology tests showed no sedatives or alcohol in her system. A landfill search did not reveal a large amount of blood. This suggested the body had been transported there after the killing to hide it. Investigators now had enough to charge Chance Donahoe. His browser history included searches on disposing of human remains and cleaning crime scenes, conducted within a week of Shannon's disappearance. Supporting a theory of premeditation, still, he did not confess and maintained his innocence. To strengthen the case, investigators set out to link him to each stage of the crime by re-examining all evidence. Soil from his car trunk matched soil from the dump site, and shoe prints matched as well. The shoes' wear patterns were unique and consistent with his gait. Microscopic blood traces were found on the tread and exterior of the shoes, further implicating him. His clothes were wet because he tried to wash away blood using a specific cleaning agent, but microscopic droplets remained. Detectives pulled GPS data and photos from his cloud storage to place him at key locations. He had deleted much of this data, indicating an attempt to cover his tracks. Deleted material included communications with Shannon shortly before her murder, revealing extensive contact and direct threats from him, contradicting his claim that he had left her alone. Shannon's interest in improving home security appears to have stemmed from Chance's obsessive behavior, but she had not done so before the attack. Interviews with his acquaintances described emotional instability worsened by substance abuse. Psychiatrists assessed him as capable of impulsive violence and prepared a psychological profile to be used as indirect evidence in court. Forensic experts concluded the murder occurred in Shannon's home. Chance then transported the body in the trunk of his car to an abandoned dumpster, trying to avoid detection. This was supported by the physical evidence and geolocation data. With this evidence, prosecutors built a strong case without needing a confession. Chance was arrested a little over a week into the investigation and charged with first-degree murder. His attorney immediately sought weaknesses in the case, filing a motion to exclude data obtained via cellular networks. The defense argued that cell tower triangulation was too imprecise to place Chance at the scene during the murder. The prosecution countered with a report showing they used all available sources, Wi-Fi, GPS, and device logs from Chance's phone. Combined, these produced a verified timeline, far more precise than cell towers alone. The defense then tried to challenge other evidence, particularly the soil found in his trunk, claiming its composition was common throughout the state of Ohio. This was disproven. The soil at the dump site had a distinct mineral profile that exactly matched the soil in the trunk. Despite repeated attempts to undermine the evidence, the defense aimed only to create reasonable doubt to reduce culpability. Even as each challenge was successfully rebutted, the prosecution's evidence was not especially strong, and much of it did not directly implicate Chance. For example, the fingerprint on the container and the tarp used to wrap the body was smudged and unreliable. After the preliminary hearings, the prosecution finalized its witness list. This list included the forensic expert who examined the body, the crime scene investigator, and the digital analyst who had combed through Chance's phone movements and other sources. The defense's final strategy was to attack Chance's psychological profile. They argued that Chance's history of emotional instability and substance abuse could unfairly bias the jury. The prosecution agreed to limit that background, choosing to emphasize physical evidence instead. Chance's trial began roughly 9 months after Shannon's disappearance. A 12-person jury was selected with sufficient background to understand complex forensic evidence. The prosecution presented a case built on physical, digital, and forensic findings intended to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. Their reconstruction shows Chance killing Shannon and dumping her body in an abandoned industrial park. Chance did not confess and continued to deny involvement. The case faced challenges. There were no eyewitnesses, which gave the defense room to question the prosecution's narrative. The first witness was the investigator who searched Shannon's home. He described signs of a thorough cleaning, but noted a partially erased bloodstain on the kitchen floor near a back door. Testing confirmed the blood was Shannon's. A digital forensics expert then explained data from Chance's devices and other sources that helped establish a timeline for the night he left Powell and allegedly killed Shannon. The defense challenged the reliability of cell tower data, but the expert clarified that the analysis did not rely on towers alone. Investigators' conclusions were also supported by home Wi-Fi logs. The forensic scientists testified about microscopic traces of Shannon's blood on Chance's clothing and shoes, which matched her DNA. Shoe print evidence matched Chance's footwear, including unique wear patterns, consistent with his gait. The autopsy findings were presented with limited graphic detail per the pretrial agreement. A geologist testified that soil from Chance's car matched the mineral and organic composition of soil at the abandoned industrial yard. The defense argued that soil in Ohio is broadly similar, but the specific match to the industrial site undercut that claim. With no defense witnesses to counter the forensic experts, it was difficult to undermine the prosecution's interpretation. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 8 hours and found Chance Donahoe guilty of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. A week later, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 31 years, the maximum allowed under state law. The verdict brought relief to Shannon Hyatt's family, who sought justice for her and accountability for her death. It was a Friday morning in Warner Robins, Georgia, the day after Thanksgiving. At the house on Forest Drive, something was terribly wrong. At 9:10 a.m., a steady voice called 911 to report what he believed to be an attempted self-harm. The caller was 57-year-old Brian McManus. He said that after returning from walking his dog, he had found his wife, 63-year-old Lucille Ann McManus, dead from what looked like a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Yet when police arrived, the scene told a very different story. There was no gun, no shell casings. His wife, lying across the bed, bore devastating blunt force injuries and signs of strangulation. It quickly became clear this was not self-harm. This was murder. Brian, who had reported it was about to become the prime suspect in one of the most calculated and cold-blooded killings in recent Georgia history. Why is he suspected? And what is the truth? Let's follow the developments of the case together. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her as Ann. That was what they called Lucille Ann McManus, a woman whose kindness seemed to radiate from her front, her porch. At 63, she had endured loss and hardship, but she never let it harden her spirit. She was thoughtful by nature, always remembering people's birthdays and greeting neighbors with a friendly wave from her garden. She also had a close, almost maternal, relationship with her granddaughter, Jessica. Warner Robins is a quiet city of about 80,000 people, just 10 miles from Robins Air Force Base in central Georgia. It is the kind of place where violent crime is rare and where neighbors still look out for one another. For Ann, it had been the perfect place to build a multi-generational household. She shared her home with Jessica and 2 great-grandchildren, creating a lively space filled with the rhythms of family life. Ann had been a widow for several years. Although she cherished her role as the breadwinner of her family, she still had moments of loneliness. As a woman who loved deeply and lived fully, she still longed for simple friendship, a companion to share morning coffee, evening TV, or small daily adventures with daily I. Those closest to her often said she was trusting, maybe too trusting. She believed in the goodness of people, a quality that made her warm and approachable, but also left her vulnerable to someone willing to exploit her loneliness. In 2022, at age 61, Ann made a choice. She decided to try online dating. She created a Tinder profile, uploaded a few photos, and cautiously stepped into the world of second chances. She could not have known that this decision would ultimately cost her everything. When Ann's profile appeared on Brian McManus's phone, he immediately saw not love, not companionship, but opportunity. At 55, Brian presented himself as a polished British gentleman with a proud background in law enforcement. He told Ann he had spent 17 years as a police officer with London's Metropolitan Police, painting a picture of honor and integrity. What he didn't share was the truth. His career ended in disgrace after multiple women came forward to say he made them feel threatened and abused. Forced out of the force, he left with a tarnished profile. Instead, he created a persona to attract someone like Anne, who desired stability, respect, and true love. Their online chats quickly turned into phone calls, then into in-person meetings. Brian was charming in the way practiced manipulators often are, knowing exactly what to say to seem like the answer to Anne's hopes. He spoke of wanting a fresh start in America, of seeking someone special to share his life with, of building something meaningful together. What Anne never realized was that this was not Brian's first attempt at using marriage as a means to secure a residency. He had previously married a woman in Idaho, a relationship that ended in divorce after he was arrested for domestic violence. The pattern was already there: exploitation, deceit, abandonment. Of course, Brian was careful to keep those details hidden from his new target. The courtship moved with unsettling speed. Within just 3 months of connecting online, Brian proposed to Anne. For a woman who had nearly given up on the hope of love, it seemed like a fairy tale. This sophisticated British man who claimed to adore her, who spoke of building a life together, who appeared to be everything she had been waiting for. In 2022, the two were married, and Brian moved into the family home on Wake Forest Drive. Overnight, he became part of a household that included not only Anne, but also her granddaughter, Jessica, and 2 great-grandchildren. From the outside, it might have looked like a modern, blended family finding joy together. Yet from the very beginning, warning signs flickered. Multiple witnesses would later testify that the marriage appeared to be motivated less by romance and more by Brian's desire to obtain a green card and secure permanent residency in the United States. The timing was suspicious. He had pushed for marriage unusually quickly, and his demeanor shifted once the paperwork was complete. But Anne chose to believe in her husband rather than question his intentions. Once Brian had secured his place in Anne's home and seemingly solidified his path to residency, his carefully crafted mask began to slip. The charming gentleman she had met online slowly revealed himself to be something far darker, calculating, deceitful, cold. He began taking frequent trips to Florida, claiming they were for business. He would pack a bag, kiss Anne goodbye, and vanish for days at a time, explaining vaguely that meetings, but the truth was far different. Brian wasn't in Florida for business. He was visiting his mistress. The woman he was secretly involved with was herself married, turning the affair into a double betrayal that underscored his utter disregard for both his wife and the sanctity of marriage. For months, Brian maintained this elaborate deception with the same ruthless calculation with which he approached the marriage. He would return from his trips and slip seamlessly back into the role of devoted husband, professing love to Anne, joining family dinners, and maintaining the facade of a committed partner. But it was all a performance. District Attorney Eric Edwards would later describe Brian as a serial liar and conman, a man who viewed women as disposable tools for his own advancement. Those closest to Anne began to notice subtle shifts. Jessica later recalled how he grew increasingly distant during family gatherings, withdrawing from conversation and seeming ill at ease when expected to engage naturally with the household he had supposedly joined. There was something unsettling about his presence, something just beneath the surface that no one could quite name. Looking back, investigators have clearly traced the pattern from his dismissal from the Metropolitan Police Department after allegations of abuse, a failed marriage in Idaho, marred by domestic violence, and now his exploitation of Anne for immigration purposes. In each case, the script was the same. Brian targeted vulnerable women, gained their trust, exploited their affection, and discarded them when they were no longer useful. What made Brian especially dangerous was his ability to juggle multiple deceptions at once while appearing, to the outside world, completely normal. Prosecutors later described him as a textbook narcissist, a man convinced he was always the cleverest person in the room. That arrogance would eventually contribute to his undoing. The most chilling part of Brian's deception was how deeply he embedded himself into Anne's world. He knew her habits, her vulnerabilities, her daily rhythms. He had full access to her home, her family, her trust. And when the time came to silence her permanently, Brian would use all of that intimate knowledge against her. November 2023 marked the beginning of the end for Brian's carefully constructed deception. That month, he made a mistake so careless, so revealing of his true priorities that it would ultimately cost Anne her life. In what could only be described as arrogance-fueled recklessness, Brian accidentally sent Anne a text message meant for his mistress in Florida. The message was loving and personal, clearly showing that Brian was having an affair. For Anne, reading that message must have felt like the floor collapsing beneath her. The man she had trusted with her heart and her home was not only unfaithful, but his affair appeared far more emotionally significant than the marriage he shared with her. Anne was not someone to quietly accept betrayal. She confronted Brian directly, demanding explanations and expressing the raw pain and anger any betrayed spouse would feel. The argument was heated. Anne expressed feeling deeply deceived, manipulated, and humiliated. In that confrontation, Anne made a decision that would ultimately seal her fate. In a moment of heartbreak and fury, she told Brian she intended to report their marriage to immigration authorities, exposing it as a sham and threatening to undo everything he had schemed for. For Brian, her threat represented nothing short of disaster. If she followed through, he would face deportation back to the United Kingdom. His green card, the very reason for the marriage, would be revoked, and his elaborate plan for a new life in America would collapse. But rather than accept the consequences of his lies, Brian began contemplating something far darker. To him, the problem wasn't his infidelity or the fraudulent marriage. It was Anne herself. She had become an obstacle, a liability, and in his worldview, women who stood in his way were disposable. The transformation from husband to potential killer didn't happen overnight. The change was gradual. It was caused by the same cold and calculating way he approached everything in their relationship. Brian began to plan her murder. At 9:10 on November 24, 2023, the Warner Robins Police Department received an emergency call. The caller was Brian McManus. His voice was disturbingly calm, as he reported what he claimed was his wife's self-harm. Brian told the operator that he had just come back from walking the dog and that he had found his wife dead. He added that it looked like an obvious self-inflicted gunshot wound. When detectives Carmen Thompson and Elizabeth Smith arrived at the McManus home, Wake Forest Drive, they found Brian waiting in the front yard. His demeanor immediately struck them as odd. Here was a man claiming to have just discovered his wife's tragic death, yet he showed no grief, no shock, no visible distress. He recited his story with mechanical precision. He had taken the family dog for a walk, returned around 9:00 a.m., and found Anne dead in the bedroom. He insisted she had shot herself, though he could not explain why there was no gun at the scene. As the detectives entered the home, it was immediately obvious something was wrong. Anne's body lay naked across the bed, her head bearing massive injuries, utterly inconsistent with a gunshot wound. No firearm was present, no shell casings, no gunpowder residue. Instead, the bedroom told the story of a savage beating. Blood spattered the walls and ceiling in patterns that spoke of a prolonged and brutal attack. The injuries to Anne's head made it clear she had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object. More troubling still was Brian's behavior as investigators examined the scene. He showed little concern for his wife or curiosity about the investigation. Instead, he seemed most interested in whether he was being viewed as a suspect. Detectives quickly noticed fresh scratch marks on his arms. When asked about them, Brian claimed he hadn't noticed and offered no explanation for how they got there. The crime scene told a story of savage violence, but one crucial piece was missing: the murder weapon. Investigators could see that Anne had been beaten with a heavy object, but the weapon used was nowhere to be found. It was clear the killer had removed it from the house, and without that weapon, proving murder in court would be much harder. The first breakthrough came from a neighbor who told investigators he had seen Brian walking his dog that morning. What stood out was the route. Instead of his usual path, Brian had taken an odd detour toward a drainage ditch near the house. That clue sent detectives searching for surveillance footage. Security cameras from homes and businesses around the neighborhood were collected, and when investigators reviewed the recordings, the truth became clear. At 8:45 a.m. on November 24, Brian could be seen leaving the house with the dog, heading straight for the drainage ditch, tossing objects into the water, and then calmly walking home. Less than half an hour later, He was on the phone with 911. Reporting his wife's supposed self-harm, a search team combed the drainage ditch, and what they pulled from the murky water erased all doubt. Investigators recovered a bloodied rubber mallet, the murder weapon, and a cell phone Brian had tried to destroy. Forensic testing confirmed the mallet was used to bludgeon Ann to death. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's autopsy revealed the full extent of the brutality. Ann had died from massive blunt force trauma to the head and manual strangulation. Her injuries were catastrophic. Most haunting of all, the autopsy showed that Ann had fought for her life. Una hair fingernails. Forensic analysts found Brian's DNA. Those fresh scratches on his arms, noticed by officers at the scene, were defensive wounds inflicted by Ann as she struggled against her attacker. The deeper detective dug. The clearer Brian's motive became. FBI cell phone data confirmed his frequent business trips to Florida were actually visits to his married mistress. Investigators also learned about the incriminating text Brian had mistakenly sent Ann, exposing the affair. Jessica confirmed her grandmother had confronted Brian and threatened to report their marriage to immigration authorities as fraudulent. For Brian, that meant deportation back to his country and the collapse of everything he had schemed for. Faced with this evidence, Brian's calm facade began to crack. He cycled through one desperate lie after another, each more implausible than the last, each dismantled by investigators. His first tactic was perhaps the cruelest. He accused Jessica and her partner of killing Ann. It was a baseless attempt, not just to save himself, but to shift suspicion onto grieving family members. FBI cell phone location data quickly destroyed this story, proving Jessica and her partner were miles away when the murder took place. When his attempt to blame family members failed, Brian pivoted again, claiming Ann had been the victim of a home invasion gone wrong. According to him, intruders had broken in, killed her for unknown reasons, and then fled. But the story collapsed immediately. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere, no valuables missing, and security footage sealed Brian's fate. The cameras showed only 2 people at the house that morning, Ann and Brian. No one else had entered or left the property. As each of Brian's lies unraveled, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He clung to his claims of innocence, but every time investigators uncovered new evidence, he would alter his story in an attempt to explain it away. This shifting narrative convinced detectives they were not dealing with a heartbroken widower, but with a calculating killer determined to say anything to escape responsibility. By the end, the evidence left no room for doubt. Investigators concluded that Brian waited for Ann to finish her morning shower before striking her with a rubber mallet. When the blows did not kill her instantly, he strangled her with his bare hands. Afterward, he carefully staged the scene, taking the dog on a walk while discarding the murder weapon and his phone in a drainage ditch. Then, with chilling composure, he dialed 911. On November 25, 2023, just one day after the killing, Brian was arrested and charged with malice murder. His trial began on July 7, 2025, lasted 6 days. Prosecutors presented a devastating case, DNA evidence linking him to defensive wounds on Ann's body, surveillance footage showing him disposing of the murder weapon, and testimony establishing his long pattern of exploiting and discarding women. Throughout the proceedings, Brian sat expressionless, even as the most damning evidence was laid out before him. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Brian McManus guilty of murder. On July 16, 2025, Judge Edward D. Luke Meyer sentenced Brian McManus to life in prison without parole. He would never walk free again. For Ann's family, the verdict brought justice but no comfort. Their grief was magnified by the cruelty of Brian's attempts to shift blame onto them during the investigation. Prosecutors called him what he had shown himself to be, an evil sociopath who viewed women as disposable objects to be used and discarded. The case underscored the vulnerability of older adults searching for companionship and the dangers of predatory behavior hidden behind charm and deceit. Lucille Ann McManus should have been able to spend her later years surrounded by the family she adored, enjoying peace, love, and stability. Instead, she became the victim of a man who saw her only as a means to an end. She must be remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived, with generosity, warmth, and a deep belief in the goodness of others. It was that very quality that made her vulnerable to Brian McManus, but it was also what made her cherished by everyone who knew her. Vladimir Heukler, a 43-year-old man, hardworking, gentle, loving family man, suddenly disappeared. He did not show up for work, did not call, did not leave a message. At first, everyone thought it was just a mysterious disappearance. But that night, the truth was revealed in a way no one could have imagined. The police opened the freezer that his wife had been guarding like a fortress for days. Among the bags of frozen meat, they discovered an unusual solid mass. Upon closer inspection, they realized that it was Valdimir's body, which had been there all along. He had not been missing, nor had he ever left the house. And the person suspected of killing and hiding his body was the woman who had sworn to love him forever. After all, what happened in that house on November 14? And why did a peaceful family turn into a tragedy of betrayal and crime? Vladimir Heukler was born in 1979 in Brazil. He grew up in a large family where he learned responsibility and the value of hard work. As an adult, he was considered a kind and trustworthy person in the community. He worked as a driver and managed a small cattle business in the countryside. Life appeared stable. He was married to Janet, whom he loved deeply, and they had 2 sons, Jonathan and Mateus. For a time, their home seemed happy. That changed when Mateus was about a year old. Vladimir confessed to Janet that he had another relationship and a child with Claudia Fernandez Tavares, a former teacher who had also worked with dairy cattle. Claudia had given birth to a daughter, Gabriela. Just months after Mateus was born, Janet was devastated. Although deeply hurt, she chose not to divorce, hoping Vladimir would end his double life and return fully to their family. Meanwhile, Vladimir moved in with Claudia for a period to help care for Gabriela. Claudia left her job to raise their daughter. The situation grew more complex as the children formed bonds. Gabriela often visits Jonathan and Mateus, and the 3 children play together, their innocence contrasting with the conflict between the adults. For Janet, daily life became a struggle. Claudia would follow the family in the streets, watch their movements, and disrupt their routine. Even family events were tense. On one occasion, as Vladimir drove Janet and their children to her mother's birthday party, Claudia trailed them in her car. The pursuit became so unnerving that Janet hid in the vehicle to avoid being seen. Claudia kept repositioning her car to maintain sight of them. After a long, tense drive, they finally managed to lose her. Janet later described the episode as bordering on madness. The confrontations continued. Claudia appeared at private gatherings where Vladimir and Janet tried to spend time with friends. More than once, Vladimir hid to avoid a scene. Claudia's attempts to control him intensified. She could not accept that he still saw Janet, whom she viewed as a rival. The harassment reached their home. Claudia called relentlessly, taking advantage of the lack of caller ID at the time. Anyone who answered, including Janet's mother, faced threats, mozzeri, and cruel remarks. Claudia brags about her relationship with Vladimir and insults Janet, saying that she is only good at housework and that Vladimir feels disgusted by her. According to Janet, those claims did not reflect her reality with Vladimir. Eventually, the strain became too much. Exhausted and unable to endure the intrusion, Janet made a heartbreaking choice. She packed Valdimir's belongings and left them at Claudia's door, effectively forcing him to move out. From then on, Vladimir lived with Claudia but remained involved in his sons' lives. As Jonathan and Mateus became teenagers, they continued to see their father regularly, hanging out, eating, and sharing moments that were almost normal. Despite the conflict between the adults, Janet also visited occasionally And despite the tension, Valdemir treated her with respect. Valdemir continued to support his children, Mateus and Jonathan, financially and emotionally. Over time, the fractured family found a fragile balance. Some weekends they even get together for barbecues and parties. Jonathan started his own family and, like Mateus, visited their father, Valdemir, about once a month. Gabriela chose a different path. At 10, she moved out on her own. Her relationship with her father, Valdemir, became increasingly distant, although she remained close to her mother, Claudia. By mid-2022, after years of complications, Valdemir and Claudia finally married. At the same time, Valdemir faced a profound loss, his father's death. The inheritance and the division of land among his siblings stirred new conflicts within the extended family. Some of Valdemir's father's assets and funds are managed by his sons and close associates, not directly in his name. Despite the challenges, Valdemir kept a stable income by working as a driver, receiving a pension, and continuing his livestock business. He planned to invest his inheritance in more land and hoped to secure a better future for his children. In early November 2022, Jonathan visited the home where Valdemir lived with Claudia, bringing his wife and their 3 young children. Although Jonathan still distrusted Claudia, seeing her as strict and controlling, he chose to keep the peace and share family time when needed. That weekend, Valdemir and Claudia's friends also came to visit. Everything seemed calm and normal. They laughed, ate together, and talked late into the night. Jonathan and his family even stayed over. But the following week, Jonathan and his brother Mateus noticed their father had gone unusually silent. By Tuesday, November 15, 2022, concern turned into alarm. Valdemir, known for his punctuality and responsibility, failed to show up for work. His colleagues, worried, contacted Claudia. Her response was unexpected. She didn't know where he was. Within hours, she reported him missing to the local police. Janette and her sons, Mateus and Jonathan, did not hear directly from Claudia. A family acquaintance delivered the news. Jonathan panicked. Fearing his father had fainted or suffered an accident in the fields, the family searched the rural areas he frequented, but found nothing. Rumors soon spread. Some have suggested that Valdemir may have harmed himself. His family rejected that idea. They knew him as cheerful and full of plans. He was financially stable, managed livestock, and adored his children. They insisted that the idea that Valdemir could have harmed himself was absurd. A temporary departure seemed more likely, perhaps to cool tensions with Claudia, or to make a point. Still, no one imagined the grim truth that would soon emerge. Jonathan and his wife put aside their doubts and went to Claudia's home to help. By that evening, the area was tense. Police, firefighters, and neighbors were searching for any trace of Valdemir. Jonathan checked his father's phone for clues, but found nothing unusual. Claudia said the weekend had been ordinary, pizza with friends and a peaceful Sunday. It sounded reassuring, until small details raised doubts. Jonathan and his wife stayed the night with Claudia. She refused to sleep in the bedroom, choosing the sofa in the living room so she could stay awake if Valdemir returned. From there, she had a clear view of the refrigerator. When Jonathan went to get water, she reacted with unusual intensity, as if him opening the fridge made her nervous. At first, Jonathan dismissed it as stress, but in the days that followed, Claudia remained strangely possessive of the refrigerator. She wouldn't let anyone else open it, insisting on distributing food herself to the many volunteers helping with the search. On Saturday, November 19, 3 days after filing the missing person report, she was called to the police station to give a formal statement. Investigators didn't initially consider Claudia a suspect, but her close relationship with Valdemir made questioning unavoidable. During the interview, officers noticed visible injuries on her body that looked like signs of a struggle. When asked, she agreed to a forensic exam. Shortly after leaving the station, she disappeared. Almost simultaneously, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A neighbor came forward with a crucial observation. Claudia's freezer, usually nearly empty, had recently appeared unusually full. Friends and neighbors knew she rarely kept more than a few basics. Yet when police entered her home, the freezer was packed with items no one remembered her buying. The oddity immediately drew investigators' attention. With few leads and a sense that something was seriously wrong, officers decided to examine everything, even details that seemed far-fetched. That night, they began removing the stacked bags and packages. Layer by layer, a chilling truth emerged. Beneath the frozen goods lay the body of 43-year-old Valdemir. Preserved in the freezer, Claudia had guarded so closely. Initial results showed a grim scenario. Claudia had cleaned out the cupboard, placed her husband's body in it, and meticulously covered it with food to hide it. The discovery shocked the community. Just a few hours later, an arrest warrant was issued for Claudia. While rumors were rife, everyone thought the manhunt would be long and difficult. But the result was simple. Not long after, Claudia turned herself in at the police station. Before that, she had posted a video that went viral on social media, saying that she would accept any punishment under the law. During interrogation, Claudia confessed. She said she had lived under constant threats and that Valdemir repeatedly told her he would kill her. Believing he might carry out his threat, she claimed she acted in self-defense. According to her, on the night of November 14, 2022, she gave him a sleeping pill. After he lost consciousness, she bound his limbs using techniques she knew from working on dairy farms. She admitted she hesitated, then suffocated him with a plastic bag, motivated by fear for her life and her daughter's safety. She described Valdemir as consumed by jealousy, citing an incident 2 weeks earlier when he slapped her in public, which she said was the breaking point. On the night of the killing, she said he forbade her from attending a New Year's celebration with coworkers. She insisted the act was not planned revenge, but a desperate attempt to survive. Afterward, she told investigators she felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Her defense lawyer supported this account, portraying her as a victim of long-term psychological and physical abuse. On camera, Claudia repeated the same message. It was him or her, and she had no choice. But the evidence suggested otherwise: her injuries, inconsistencies in her story, and, most of all, the concealment of the body in the freezer pointed to a more sinister scenario. Authorities charged Claudia with aggravated murder, concealment of a corpse, and perjury. The case quickly spread across Brazilian media and social networks, sparking national debate about domestic violence, mental health, and the complex line between victimhood and responsibility. For Valdemir's family, no explanation could ease the pain. The discovery left a permanent scar. Jonathan was especially haunted by one memory. During the frantic search, when he and his wife stayed at Claudia's house, she insisted on serving food herself and never let anyone open the freezer. At the time, it seemed like a quirky habit. After the truth came out, he couldn't stop replaying that moment. While volunteers gathered in the house to help, Claudia calmly walked to the refrigerator and took food from the very place where Valdemir's body was hidden. Cold and silent. For Gabriela, the revelation was unbearable. She had lost her father in the most unimaginable way, and the woman accused of killing him was her own mother. Shock collided with loyalty. Despite the horror and accusations, Gabriela tries to stand by Claudia. Jeanette, Jonathan, and Mateus understood that Gabriela was facing the greatest loss of all. Whatever their own grief, they couldn't ignore that she was a young woman suddenly without a father and with her mother in custody. Claudio, however, held her ground. She told investigators she acted to protect her daughter, Gabriela. She claimed Valdemir was jealous of her bond with Gabriela, and that Gabriela's decision to move away had been driven by the toxic environment he created. Meanwhile, the logistics of death moved painfully slowly. Defrosting Valdemir's body took days, delaying the wake and prolonging the family's agony. When the funeral finally took place, what should have been a quiet farewell turned into a public spectacle. The media swarmed the ceremony, drawn by the shocking details. Cameras flashed as neighbors, friends, and strangers crowded outside, their curiosity tinged with morbid fascination. For the grieving family, the intrusion only deepened their pain. As the investigation advanced, authorities reached a firm conclusion: Claudia had acted with premeditation. Yet one question persisted: did she act alone? Some suspected an accomplice, someone who might have helped move or hide the body, but according to the civil police, all the evidence indicated that Claudia acted by herself. Even Valdemir's family, who initially doubted she could have done it alone, came to agree if she'd had help. They reasoned the body likely would have been disposed of more conventionally, abandoned in a car or hidden in the countryside. Using the freezer suggested fear of being seen and improvisation under pressure. The motive remained contested. Investigators found conflicting accounts when examining Valdemir's reputation. One of his sisters had filed a complaint accusing him of violent behavior. On closer scrutiny, however, it seemed tied to long-standing disputes over inherited land rather than domestic abuse. Records also showed that Claudia filed a domestic violence complaint in 2019. According to reports, the incident stemmed from a heated argument over Gabriella's desire to leave home to study in another city, a decision that Valdemir vehemently opposed. Claudia helped her daughter move without Valdemir's permission. When he returned and discovered what had happened, tensions erupted. Later, he accused Claudia of taking a large sum of money from the house, which he believed was meant to fund Gabriella's move. Claudia insisted he had taken the money himself. For Janet, these accusations were deeply painful. She remained steadfast in her belief that Valdemir was never physically abusive toward Claudia and described him as a provider. Another troubling detail emerged. Valdemir kept large amounts of cash at home to buy a new piece of land. Friends said he had saved between $38,000 and $50,000. One brother claimed to have seen the money himself. Additionally, Valdemir often deposited money into accounts held by relatives or trusted acquaintances. These findings fueled suspicions that Claudia's motives might not have been purely about fear or survival. Family members suggested she may not have meticulously planned the crime, but had entertained the idea over time, waiting for the right moment. They believe she acted before Valdemir could install new security cameras in their home, cameras that would have limited her movements and possibly exposed her actions. In August 2023, the case resurfaced when a court in Santa Catarina granted Claudia conditional release with electronic monitoring. While awaiting trial, she was permitted to work at a construction factory during the day, and as a restaurant cook at night. The decision sparked public outrage, with many viewing it as a miscarriage of justice. Shortly thereafter, the Superior Court of Justice reversed the ruling, citing the seriousness of the crime, the concealment of the body, and her attempts to mislead investigators. Claudia was returned to preventive detention. Her lawyer, undeterred, continued her defense under a contingency agreement, stating he would only charge fees if she were acquitted. He publicly affirmed that Claudia fully trusted his work. The jury ultimately sentenced Claudia Tavares Hochler to 20 years and 24 days in prison. The case of Valdemir Hochler remains one of the most shocking in Brazil's recent history. For Valdemir's family and friends, the tragedy left a lasting wound. The man they loved and depended on was gone, hidden in an unimaginable place, while the woman who claimed to love him stood accused of taking his life. And so, the central questions remain: was Claudia a victim driven to the edge by years of abuse? Or did she act with calculated control and resentment? What justice is appropriate for this crime? Is Claudia's sentence of 20 years and 24 days too lenient? Many of us have walked home alone late at night. Feelings of insecurity or even fear are inevitable. However, we often reassure ourselves that the danger is somewhere far away, with someone else, not with us, and tell ourselves, "I will be fine." On the night of January 16, 2019, Aya Mazave, 21, stepped off a tram in Bundora, Melbourne, Just after midnight, security cameras captured her walking calmly along the deserted street. Everything seemed completely normal. Her apartment was only about 2 kilometers from the tram stop. To ease her loneliness, she called her sister in Israel. They talked for about 5 minutes, sharing their usual happy moments. Then, suddenly, her sister heard a scream of horror, the sound of her phone falling to the ground, followed by the sound of cars rushing by. Aya never responded again. And it was not until the next morning that the harsh truth of what had happened to her finally emerged. To understand how Aya came to be in Melbourne that night, we need to know her story. Born in Israel in 1997, she was one of 4 daughters. From a young age, she showed exceptional intelligence, became fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, and Chinese. She studied business at Shanghai University in China, where her father ran a company. She planned to join him in business after graduation. In August 2018, she arrived in Melbourne as an exchange student at La Trobe University. She chose business studies to expand on her experience from Shanghai and also hoped to improve her English while in Australia. Aya quickly settled into life in her new city. Living close to the campus, she embraced Australian culture, attended classes, and built new friendships. Everything seemed full of promise. She had many plans for the future. Tragically, all of those plans ended on January 16, 2019. That day began like any other. Aya went to lectures, spent time with friends, and later made plans to see a comedy show at the Comedy Republic Theatre in Melbourne's city centre. A cheerful young woman who loved to laugh, she saw the performance as a way to unwind. The show started around 9 p.m. and lasted about 2 hours. Afterwards, still in high spirits, she walked to the tram, stopped for her ride home. Just after midnight, Aya stepped off the tram, immediately called her sister Ruba. Back in Israel, they talked about the show, their plans for the coming days, shared the usual warmth of their conversations. Aya joked and laughed, sounding happy. Then, only minutes later, Ruba heard her sister scream. Aya's voice turned frantic as she shouted at someone to let her go. The sound of the phone hitting the ground followed, noises of a struggle, then silence, only the sounds of passing cars. Ruba later described it as the most terrifying experience of her life. She shouted Aya's name into the phone, but there was no answer. She hung up and immediately tried to call back, but Aya never responded. In shock and despair, Ruba alerted her family. Aya's parents and other sisters frantically tried to reach her through calls and messages, but there was no reply. Eventually, the family contacted the Australian police. By then it was about 6 a.m. In Melbourne. Roughly an hour later, a man on his way to work noticed something disturbing in the bushes near a shopping center. Hoping he was mistaken, he looked closer. Tragically, his fears were confirmed. It was the body of a young woman. She was partially undressed, bore visible injuries, and showed signs of having been set on fire. The location was only a few minutes' walk from the tram stop where Aya had gotten off, and less than 2 kilometers from her apartment. The man immediately called police. When the police arrived, they immediately secured the area. It was clear from the start that a crime had occurred. Scattered around the body were several personal belongings: Aya's bag, AirPods, headphones, and other items that would later become key pieces of evidence. She had sustained severe head injuries, and there were clear signs of an attempt to set her body on fire. It appeared the perpetrator had tried to destroy the evidence with flames, but the fire had not spread far. Aya's identity was confirmed almost immediately when investigators found documents bearing her name. Meanwhile, her family, already terrified after the strange phone call, received the devastating news from Australian authorities. Her father, Zaid Mazava, later flew to Melbourne to identify her body. He described that moment as one that broke his heart forever. Such a brutal attack on an international student drew intense media attention. At a press conference, detectives described the crime as horrific and cowardly. From the outset, police emphasized that the attack appeared to be random rather than premeditated. Newspaper headlines. Television broadcasts reported widely on the murder, sparking fear and outrage across Melbourne. Students at La Trobe University, where Aya was studying, were particularly shaken. Many female students admitted they were afraid to walk home alone at night, and the campus immediately strengthened security measures. The crime occurred in Bandura, a quiet suburb where violent incidents of this nature were extremely rare. That made the case even more shocking. On the evening of January 17, 2019, hundreds of people gathered in central Melbourne for a candlelight vigil in Aya's memory. Over the following days, flowers and handwritten notes were placed at the crime scene. Similar vigils were also held in Israel, Aya's home country. Both the family and the public demanded answers. Meanwhile, the police devoted significant resources to tracking down the perpetrator. A special task force of detectives was formed and worked around the clock, determined not to overlook a single clue that could influence the outcome of the case. As is standard, police initially withheld many details of the investigation from the public. Only later did the full picture begin to emerge. Forensic investigators had discovered critical evidence at the scene: a metal pipe, believed to be the murder weapon, stained with blood, a t-shirt and a baseball cap, both carrying traces of blood, a discarded cigarette butt, and other items likely linked to the attacker. All of these were sent to the lab for testing. Analysts were able to extract DNA samples from several of the items, and comparisons were made against databases. There were signs of a struggle. Aya's clothing was torn, on her fingernails. Forensic scientists found fragments of skin, evidence of her desperate fight for survival. Although the attacker had attempted to burn her body, the fire did not spread, leaving behind crucial physical evidence. At the same time, detectives combed through digital evidence. CCTV cameras at and near the tram stop showed Aya disembarking just after midnight. Other surveillance footage revealed a suspicious man wearing a baseball cap resembling the one found near her body. The man appeared to wander aimlessly along the street before crossing paths with Aya. The autopsy provided investigators with a clearer understanding of the events. The results confirmed the sheer brutality of the assault. The official cause of death was multiple head injuries from blunt force trauma, inflicted with the same metal pipe recovered near the scene. Aya had been struck at least 4 times on the head and face. The force and severity of the blows suggested she likely died within minutes. The autopsy also supported detectives' suspicions. Aya's torn clothing and partial undress indicated that the attack had an abuse-assault motive. Forensic experts determined that, during or immediately after the assault, there was non-consensual intimate contact between Aya and the perpetrator. This was evidenced by characteristic injuries and the presence of DNA in intimate areas. The forensic medical examination also confirmed that fire was not the cause of death. It had been an attempt to destroy evidence after the attack. As the investigation unfolded, detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses. They began with Aya's friends, questioned students at La Trobe University, spoke to local residents, and even tracked down passengers from the tram Aya had taken that night. None of them knew of anyone who might want to harm her. No one had witnessed the attack itself. This supported the police's early theory that Aya had been a random target. Digital forensic specialists examined her phone and ruled out motives linked to her personal life. All the evidence pointed toward an unknown assailant. Crucially, DNA recovered from a cigarette butt, a t-shirt, and a baseball cap matched biological samples collected from Aya's body. The investigation moved quickly. Just 2 days after Aya's body was discovered, police identified a suspect. On January 18, 2019, detectives arrested 20-year-old Cody Herman in a park in Greensboro. He was found sitting quietly near a barbecue area, seemingly unaware that he was about to be taken into custody. Herman did not resist arrest. DNA samples collected from him at the police station matched those taken from the cigarette butt, the clothing, other items from the crime scene, and Aya herself. Surveillance footage also showed him wandering around the Bandura area on the night of the murder. Yet during interrogation, he denied any involvement. On January 19, 2019, Herman was formally charged. During the court hearing, he showed no emotion and remained silent. Given the seriousness of the allegations, The judge ordered that he be remanded in custody without bail. For the Masarwe family, the arrest offered some measure of relief amid their grief. Aya's father, Said Masalve, publicly thanked the police for their swift work, but added that no arrest could ever bring his daughter back. This led to an important question. Who was Cody Herman? And was there any connection between him and Aya? Understanding his background was crucial, as defense lawyers later attempted to use his past as a mitigating factor during trial. Herman was born in 1998 to parents of Aboriginal descent who faced financial hardship in North Melbourne. His community struggled with widespread social problems, and life at home was even harder. His father battled alcoholism and mental illness, leading to chaotic, violent épisodes. Herman's mother also struggled with alcohol, substance abuse. At times he was placed in foster care. From an early age, Herman endured both physical abuse and emotional trauma. He suffered from mental health issues but had inconsistent access to treatment. His last recorded contact with mental health services was in 2016. By then, Herman had already started abusing alcohol, substance abuse, and often lived in unstable conditions, sometimes sleeping on the streets or in abandoned houses. Despite this, he sought a creative outlet in music. Under the pseudonym MC Codez, he recorded rap tracks and shared them online. His lyrics were raw, filled with anger, reflecting the pain of a turbulent childhood and his struggle for identity in a harsh world. At the time of his arrest, Herman had no steady job. His criminal record included minor offenses from his teenage years, but nothing approaching the severity of Aya's murder. Still, psychologists who evaluated him after his arrest observed deep-seated anger, impulsivity, poor emotional control, much of it rooted in unresolved trauma from his upbringing. While these details do not excuse Herman's actions, they provide context for how someone with his background could commit such a horrific crime. Police found no evidence that Herman and Aya knew each other. There were no personal contacts or digital traces linking them. They were complete strangers. What made the case even more disturbing was that Herman had attempted to enter her apartment complex on at least 2 occasions in the 6 weeks leading up to the crime. He falsely told students he had lost his key, even though he didn't live there and had no permanent address at the time. On another occasion, he was seen loitering on the grass outside the building. Forensic psychiatrists later described him as having low intelligence and poor impulse control. Importantly, however, they found no evidence of psychosis. He understood what he was doing. The attack on Aya was not planned in advance. Herman saw an opportunity and acted on it. Tragically, Aya never had a chance to escape. She became an accidental victim. But this raised a troubling question. Was the crime itself purely impulsive? Herman later claimed he had no memory of acquiring the metal pipe or the accelerant he used to set Aya's body on fire. This point became crucial in determining whether the crime showed elements of premeditation. Surveillance footage showed him wandering near the shopping mall shortly before the attack, and at that time, he was not carrying anything resembling a pipe. Despite this, investigators found something troubling. Herman had the pipe in his hand before the attack started. He intentionally used it to hit Aya from behind, likely to quickly stop her from fighting back, running away, or asking for assistance. Despite this, detectives concluded there was no strong evidence of classic premeditation. The attack was described as unsophisticated and opportunistic, lacking signs of careful planning. There was no proof Herman had hidden the pipe beforehand or carried it with the specific intent to use it in a crime. By piecing together forensic findings, witness testimony, and surveillance footage, investigators reconstructed the timeline of that night. Aya stepped off the tram at 12 a.m. and began walking toward her apartment. The road was dimly lit, lined with bushes, a shopping mall parking lot, and quiet apartment buildings. It was a route she often took alone. Never suspecting the danger, still on the phone with her sister, she was suddenly approached from behind by Herman, who struck her in the head 4 times with the metal pipe without saying a word. On the call, Ruba heard Aya scream. Aya tried to fight back. She cursed at her attacker in Arabic and scratched at him, but the head injuries were catastrophic. She soon collapsed, unconscious. Herman dragged her body behind a hedge near the parking lot, tore at her clothes, and committed further violence. Before fleeing, he struck her again with the pipe, then doused her body in accelerant and set it on fire. The fire did not consume the evidence as he intended. Instead, it only magnified the brutality of the attack. The entire assault lasted no more than 15 minutes. As Herman escaped, he climbed over a fence, losing his baseball cap in the process. He also removed his blood-stained t-shirt and discarded it before leaving the scene. The trial began on October 1st, 2019. Herman entered the courtroom with his head lowered, avoiding eye contact. From the outset, his defense lawyers sought to stress his remorse. They presented a handwritten letter he had sent to the Massarowi family, in which he begged for forgiveness and admitted the devastation he had caused for Aya's family. However, these words were hollow. To them, Herman was the man who had stolen their daughter. No apology could undo the pain. Because Herman pleaded guilty to all charges, the Massarowi family was spared the anguish of a lengthy trial. Eventually, the court carefully reviewed the evidence in full before sentencing. A forensic medical expert testified that Aya's final moments were filled with terror and excruciating pain. The defense attempted to soften Herman's responsibility by pointing to his traumatic upbringing. A psychiatrist hired by his lawyers described him as a product of the system with a low IQ, poor impulse control, and little capacity for planning. According to the psychiatrist, while Herman's actions were brutal, they lacked sustained malicious intent. The prosecution countered firmly. They argued that no childhood trauma could excuse such a cowardly, violent, and degrading attack. Any signs of remorse? They said, come far too late. Only after the evidence against him became overwhelming. When it came time to deliver judgment, the presiding judge acknowledged Herman's disadvantaged background, mental health issues, and guilty plea. However, he was unequivocal that none of these factors could excuse his crimes. The attack was described as opportunistic, predatory, and devastating in its consequences. On October 29, 2019, Cody Herman was sentenced to 36 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 30 years. The judge emphasized that Herman posed an ongoing risk to the community, but noted that his young age and absence of serious prior convictions meant a life sentence was not appropriate. Prosecutors later appealed, seeking a life term. But in 2021, the Victorian Court of Appeal upheld the original sentence. For Aya's grieving family, the legal process brought some sense of closure, but nothing could undo the heartbreak of their loss. Aya Massarowi's murder was not just the loss of a promising young woman with dreams and a bright future. It was a reminder of the vulnerabilities that women face in their everyday lives. Her story resonated far beyond Melbourne, sparking vehicles, protests, difficult conversations about safety, violence against women, and the need for systemic change. For her family, no sentence will ever bring her back. For her friends, classmates, and the many strangers who mourned her, Aya's life continues to symbolize both tragedy and hope. The tragedy of a brilliant future stolen, and the hope that her memory will inspire greater awareness, compassion, and action. Reflecting the collective grief and anger, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews issued a powerful statement condemning the murder. He declared that the sexism in our society must change if Australia is to end its epidemic of violence against women. The people of Victoria are united in grief, united in anger, that a bright young woman's life was so cruelly taken, and he hoped they are united, too, in determination that we can, and they must, put an end to this culture of violence against women. On April 20, 1984, 18-year-old Julie Connell disappeared after walking into Kennedy Park with a book in her hand. 5 days later, her half-naked body was found in an abandoned barn. Her throat was slashed with horrific wounds. The small California town had witnessed a nightmare that lasted for decades. How did the police track him down? And what made this case haunt the entire community? Julie was born on April 15, 1966, the eldest daughter of Jim and Kathy Connell. The family lived in San Leandro, California, a suburban community on the eastern side of the San Francisco Bay. It was the kind of place where families felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. Neighbors waved as they passed by. Children played freely in their yards, and the tree-lined streets reflected a sense of calm stability. By the 1,980 San Leandro had grown to more than 60,000 residents, but it still held the atmosphere of a close-knit town. Inside their home, the Connells nurtured a warm, respectful family life. Julie thrived in that environment, focusing on her studies and personal passions. She was a dedicated student whose quiet determination and spark drew people's attention. At San Leandro High School, she excelled as an honor student. Her teachers admired her diligence, while her classmates valued her kindness and sincerity. To her younger sisters, Wendy and Patricia, Julie was more than a role model. She was someone they deeply adored. Julie was brilliant, compassionate, often volunteering at her church, reading Bible stories to children, and helping those in need. But school was not Julie's only love. She enjoyed reading, writing, performing on stage, and she dreamed of one day working as a television host. She also had a boyfriend, Tom O'Neill, who was slightly older and already in college. The two spent much of their free time together, happy in each other's company. Turning 18 was a milestone Julie cherished. She had already purchased her cap, gown for graduation, paid for a senior trip to Disneyland. On her birthday that April, she celebrated with Tom. Just months earlier, she had been accepted to California State University in Hayward, where she planned to continue her studies. Family and friends were certain she was on the brink of great things. She was simply living her life, convinced her bright future was within reach. But she could not have known that unimaginable danger awaited her, even in a place considered safe. On Friday, April 20, 1984, during the Easter weekend, the Connells had planned a family outing. Kathy, the girl's mother, suggested taking her 3 daughters to see the comedy Police Academy, but Julie had already watched the film, so she chose to spend her afternoon differently. While 15-year-old Wendy and 12-year-old Patricia laughed at the movie and ate popcorn with their mom, Julie wanted to study and read. She had a test coming up on Monday and wasn't about to lose focus. She packed her essentials, the book she was working through, some water, a small snack, and a blanket. Dressed in her favorite lavender shirt, blue jeans, and white tennis shoes, she was ready for a comfortable afternoon outdoors. Kennedy Park, located across the street from the movie theater, was the perfect spot to settle down with a good book. Julie asked her mom to meet her there after the movie ended. Around 1:00 p.m., she got out of the car, waved goodbye, and walked into the park. None of her family members realized it would be the last time they ever saw her alive. Julie spread her blanket on the grass, took out her book, and began to read. For a short while, Wendy lingad nearby, waiting for the film to start. The park was full of people enjoying the warm weather. Everything seemed calm and safe. But when the movie ended, Kathy returned to the park with her daughters. Julie was gone. At first, the Connells didn't panic. Maybe Julie had gone to get a snack, or perhaps she had gotten bored and decided to head home early. But just to be sure, Kathy walked through the park, calling out her daughter's name. There was no sign of Julie, no blanket, no book, nothing. When they returned home, Kathy half expected to find her daughter waiting, ready to explain why she hadn't met them after the movie. But the house was quiet. Julie wasn't there. With every passing minute, their unease grew heavier. When Jim Connell came home from work, he deeply worried. This is completely out of character for Julie. The family's concern quickly turned into fear that something was terribly wrong. They called Julie's classmates, her friends, even her boyfriend, Tom, but no one had seen her. Growing desperate, the Connells phoned local hospitals, praying for any scrap of news. There was none. Julie had vanished in broad daylight. When Jim and Kathy reported their fears to police, they were met with devastating indifference. Julie had just turned 18, and authorities explained they couldn't file a missing persons report for 72 hours since she was now legally an adult. To her family, it felt like a cruel technicality. Those first 24 hours are often the most critical. With each passing hour, the chances of finding her safe diminished, as so often happens. Law enforcement leaned on the simplest explanation, that Julie had run away or was out with friends. But her parents knew her better than that. Julie wasn't reckless, and she would never disappear without telling anyone. Something was very wrong. The Connells couldn't sit and wait. They began their own search, printing over 2,000 flyers and plastering them across San Leandro. They scoured Kennedy Park, walked block by block, and knocked on doors, begging for any information that might lead them to their daughter. On Easter Sunday, the family attended church, hoping for comfort. But during the service, Jim Connell was overwhelmed by a chilling wave of despair. Deep inside, he felt that Julie was never coming home. He said nothing at the time, still clinging to hope, but in his heart he knew the truth. Still, the family pressed on. They had no choice but to keep searching. What began as an ordinary spring day had become a nightmare. By the third day, they were running on desperation. Julie had been missing for 72 hours. 3 days of searching parks and streets, making calls deep into the night, and replaying every detail, wondering what clue they might have overlooked. Only then did the police finally begin an investigation, but their response was slow, detached, and dismissive. Officers repeated the idea that Julie was likely out with friends. To her family, it felt like no one in authority truly believed Julie was in danger. As other families prepared their Easter dinners, the Connells ran from street to street, handing out flyers. Julie's face was now everywhere, taped to shop windows, posted on telephone poles, even tucked under windshield wipers. Jim appeared on local television, pleading for the public's help. Soon, the search spread beyond the family. The entire community of San Leandro rallied to find Julie. Strangers carried flashlights into Kennedy Park, combing through the grass and bushes. Volunteers with dogs searched for her scent. Some even turned to psychics, desperate for answers. But day after day, no trace of Julie appeared. Then, finally, came the first clue. After watching the news coverage, a local woman called the police. Near her porch, she had found a discarded book, the very one Julie had taken to the park, stamped with her high school library's mark. She couldn't explain how it had ended up there. Not long after, another woman walking with her daughter near Kennedy Park spotted clothing on the street, a lavender shirt and a bra. The shirt matched the one Julie had been wearing that day. The bra had been cut down the middle, its straps torn apart. The evidence suggested what the Connells feared most. Something terrible had happened to Julie. When police brought the shirt and bra to the Connells' home, Kathy and Jim could hardly bear to look. The torn fabric spoke volumes. Something terrible had happened to their daughter. They hadn't been there to protect her. The realization was gut-wrenching, but they refused to give up hope. Deep down, they clung to the belief that Julie was still alive. 2 days later, another clue surfaced. 2 teenage girls reported finding a backpack beneath a payphone near a local store. At first, they had rifled through it, searching for anything valuable. Then, as they drove around, they casually tossed out items they didn't want from the car window. Only after hearing about Julie's disappearance on the news, they realizing Julie had been carrying a backpack, they confessed to their older sister, who insisted they call the police. It was another breadcrumb. On April 25, 5 days after Julie vanished, a farmer and his wife, tending cattle in a remote corner of Castro Valley, just 20 minutes from Kennedy Park, where Julie had last been seen, stumbled upon a sight so horrifying it froze them in place. Inside a corral, in the middle of an open pasture ringed by brush and hills, lay the half-naked body of a young woman. She was dead. The scene was chilling in its isolation. It was not a place anyone would wander into by accident. secluded enough to serve as the perfect spot for concealing a crime. Investigators quickly determined this was no accident. No, misfortune, pura deliberate, brutal murder. Though the young woman carried no identification, detectives' instincts told them immediately it was Julie Connell. The victim's injuries left little doubt. Her upper body was uncovered, streaked with blood and bruises. Her throat had been slashed from ear to ear 3 separate times. Her left wrist was bound with a tight, intricate knot, and her right wrist was nearly severed. As though the killer had pulled the ligature with such force it cut straight through. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms revealed she had fought back desperately, refusing to go quietly. Abrasions on her knees suggested she had been dragged across the ground before her life was taken. The evidence pointed to a frenzied attack. Forensic experts confirmed that Julie had been killed right there in the corral. Blood had soaked deep into the dirt beneath her, leaving no question the murder had taken place on that very spot. The grass and soil nearby were undisturbed. Her body had not been moved. Investigators scoured the scene inch by inch. On the second rail of the corral's gate, they found smudged dirt marks, as if someone had climbed over it. Shoe prints were visible enough to be preserved. Near the gate, detectives discovered a small plastic wrapper from a disposable scalpel, stained with what appeared to be blood. On the gate itself, fingerprint impressions were lifted and cataloged. Every fragment of evidence carried the promise of answers. At 2:00 a.m., the Connell family's phone rang. Jim answered, his stomach twisting. On the line was a detective from the sheriff's department, his voice steady but weighted with sorrow. A young woman's body had been found, and someone from the family needed to identify her. Shortly after, officers arrived at their home with an envelope of photographs. Jim looked first. The moment his eyes landed on the image, his heart shattered. He recognized his daughter instantly. His knees nearly buckled as tears filled his eyes. Then Kathy took the envelope. She sat on her daughter's bed, clutching the photos in trembling hands. The mother's sobs filled the room as she traced her daughter's features, still familiar. Though broken and battered, the truth was undeniable. Julie was gone forever. The parents were devastated when police handed them the only item found with Julie besides her clothing. A 10-cent coin. That was all that remained of her. Kathy had always told her daughters to carry a dime, the cost of a payphone call at the time, so they could reach home if needed. Julie never had the chance to use it. Now the Connells had to face the painful task of telling their younger daughters, Patricia and Wendy, the truth about Julie. 12-year-old Patricia overheard her mother say that her sister had died, but she could not fully understand what that meant. 15-year-old Wendy, who had been the last to see Julie alive, struggled with grief and guilt. She kept replaying their last moments together, wondering why she had not noticed any sign of danger. The loss deeply affected their family. Julie is an important part of their lives. Wendy and Patricia looked up to her, and now each had to deal with the grief in their own way. Jim and Kathy found it hard even to look at each other, but they shared the same goal, finding justice. Their struggle, however, was only starting. Julie Connell's body was taken to the coroner's office, where the details of the attack became clear. The autopsy showed the seriousness of the assault and explained how she died. The medical examiner determined that Julie had lost a large amount of blood from 3 deep cuts to her throat. One of these cuts severed the carotid artery, which meant she could not have survived for long. Her left wrist was bound with a complicated knot. The examiner noted that it had not been tied quickly, but by someone who likely had experience, suggesting the attack was planned. Marks on her ankles showed she had also been tied there. Although no rope was found at the scene, the autopsy also showed evidence of abuse, including bruises and injuries. Genetic materials were collected and preserved. In 1984, DNA testing was not yet available, so the samples could only be used for basic blood type comparison if a suspect was found. The autopsy results were devastating for the Connell family. Reading the list of injuries was unbearable. Knowing what Julie had gone through, Kathy later said she could not stop imagining her daughter's last moments. Jim was horrified to learn that Julie had been restrained and left defenseless. The case created fear in San Leandro. Many parents no longer allowed their children to play outside without supervision. Kennedy Park, once a popular place for families, became a reminder of the crime. The community realized that what had happened to Julie could happen to anyone. The investigation moved very slowly. At that time, there were no DNA databases, no cell phones, and no easy way to track suspects. Everything depended on witnesses, physical evidence, and chance. Investigators also faced problems because Julie disappeared in one jurisdiction but was found in another. Police departments argued over who should lead the case, and information was not shared quickly. To the Connells, this delay felt like a failure. They believed the authorities had wasted valuable time by not treating Julie's disappearance as urgent. Their frustration grew as the weeks passed without progress. Detectives tried to retrace Julie's final movements. They searched Kennedy Park but found nothing useful. They then questioned people who had been there that day. Wendy told them she had left Julie around 1:00 p.m. when her sister was lying on a blanket reading a book. Families were nearby, enjoying the afternoon. Other witnesses confirmed seeing Julie, but no one reported hearing screams or noticing anything unusual. Despite the number of people in the park, the killer had managed to act without drawing attention. The investigation reached a dead end. The detectives decided to try an approach that had rarely been used before. They recreated Julie's last known moments and invited local media to film the reenactment. Their hope was that by drawing attention to the case, someone's memory might be triggered. 15-year-old Wendy, though still deep in grief, agreed to step into her older sister's place. She wore a lavender blouse and blue jeans, similar to what Julie had worn, and sat on a blanket in the same grassy spot in Kennedy Park. The reenactment drew considerable attention from both the media and the community. Several camera crews recorded Wendy as she silently took on her sister's role, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. For the police, this unconventional tactic paid off. Shortly after the reenactment aired, investigators received a call from the manager of a nearby department store. He explained that on the very day Julie disappeared, his store had hosted an Easter party for employees in the same park. One employee recalled seeing Julie from a miniature train that looped around the park. The ride only lasted a few minutes, but by the time the train returned to the same area, Julie's blanket was empty. Detectives also gathered photographs taken during the party, which showed employees arriving, setting up for the event, sharing food at a barbecue, enjoying ice cream, and participating in an Easter egg hunt. One particular photo taken around midday captured the spot where Julie had been sitting, but unfortunately, it revealed no sign of a struggle or anything suspicious. At the same time, forensic specialists completed fingerprint analysis from the gate near the ranch where Julie's body had been found. The results, however, were another disappointment. All of the prints belonged to the property owners and their workers. A dirty mark on the railing produced no identifiable results, and even the scalpel wrapper found nearby was linked to the ranch, not to the killer. Once again, detectives felt like they had reached a dead end. Although DNA technology was still in its early stages in 1984, the preserved genetic material allowed experts to determine certain basic traits of the attacker. They established his blood type and concluded that he most likely had reddish blonde hair. With little else to go on, detectives began investigating whether the distinctive knot tied around Julie's wrist could be connected to other unsolved crimes. At the time, a number of cases of abuse of teenage girls were reported, some of which had disturbing similarities. Investigators wondered if the same person could be behind all of them. To pursue this theory, the county sheriff formed a task force to study possible links between Julie's case and the others. Detectives examined every available detail: the crime scenes, the methods used to restrain victims, the types of wounds inflicted, and the timing of the attacks. But despite the thorough review, no solid connection emerged. Currently, there is no clear link between Julie Connell's murder and any other crime. Her case appears to be isolated. Meanwhile, the lack of progress placed an enormous emotional strain on Julie's family. Jim and Kathy Connell, desperate to keep their daughter's memory alive and to push for justice, endured endless interviews, late-night strategy meetings. The constant pain of imagining Julie's last hours, the weight of their grief was heavy. Over time, exhaustion, frustration grew. For Wendy and Patricia, life after their sister's death was marked by silence, sorrow, and an overwhelming absence. Wendy later admitted that agreeing to take part in the reenactment had been both meaningful and devastating. It allowed her to honor Julie's memory and keep attention on the case, but it also forced her to relive her sister's last day in a way that was almost unbearable. Patricia, on the other hand, struggled with reminders of Julie in a quieter but equally painful way. She couldn't bring herself to read her sister's books, listen to her favorite songs, or even glance at certain family photos without breaking down. Then, about a month after Julie's murder, the Connell family began receiving late-night phone calls. The caller's voice was low and menacing. He claimed to know Julie and threatened that he would do the same thing to Wendy and Patricia. Each call left the family terrified, already broken by loss. The Connells now lived in constant fear for their remaining daughters. They contacted the police immediately. Time passed, but answers remained out of reach. Weeks turned into months, and months into years, with the investigation showing little progress. One detective even admitted to Julie Connell's parents that they might never find the person who killed their daughter. At home, Julie's bedroom became something of a shrine to her memory. Everything was left exactly as it had been. The books she loved, the small trinkets she collected, even her wallet with the carefully saved money inside. For her family, the untouched room was both a source of comfort and a painful reminder of the life that had been stolen. In the beginning, the Connells had the support of their community, but as time moved on, that support slowly faded. For Jim and Kathy, the grief never lessened. They were determined not to let their daughter's case be forgotten or buried in the archives. Over a decade passed this way. Suspects came and went. Tips dried up. The case grew colder with each passing year. By the late 1992, science had made leaps and bounds that few could have predicted. The genetic material preserved from Julie's autopsy, carefully stored, even when DNA testing was still in its infancy, would become the key to unlocking the truth. The establishment of the combined DNA index system allowed law enforcement to compare DNA from crime scenes with that of known offenders in a national database. Suddenly, cases long thought hopeless had new life. 14 years after Julie's death, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office decided to re-examine her case. The frozen samples from her body were carefully prepared and sent for modern DNA testing. After so many years, the samples were fragile, and scientists had to handle them cautiously to avoid contamination or destruction. District Attorney Angela Backers was determined. Even though the evidence initially produced no matches in combined DNA index system, she refused to give up. She reached out to a colleague, a respected forensic scientist, who had developed advanced techniques for analyzing older DNA. Weeks later, a breakthrough finally came. The DNA profile matched a man already sitting on death row in California, Robert Boyd Rhodes. Until that moment, Rhodes had never been linked to Julie's case and had not even appeared as a suspect. Yet his name was already infamous. In 1996, 12 years after Julie's murder, Rhodes kidnapped, tortured, and killed 8-year-old Michael Lyons in Yuba City, California. The case shocked the state and drew national media attention for its brutality. Michael, who lived with his mother Sandy Friend, his stepfather, Billy Friend, and 2 younger sisters, was known as a bright, kind child. He enjoyed staying after school to help his teachers and often made his classmates laugh with jokes. On the afternoon of his disappearance, Michael was walking home from school, a route of about a mile. He stopped briefly at a park between the fairgrounds and his home. A neighbor later told investigators he saw a man approach Michael, speak with him, and then lead him into a pickup truck. Because Michael didn't resist, the witness assumed they knew each other and didn't intervene, a decision that would later haunt him. Less than a day later, Michael's body was discovered in thick brush near the Feather River. The crime scene revealed shocking violence. His body bore more than 70 stab wounds, inflicted with a small file-like knife. Investigators concluded that Michael had been tortured for hours before his death. The fatal wound was a deep stab to his neck and back, severing his spinal cord. He was naked from the waist down, with his black Batman t-shirt pulled up over his head. Signs of abuse were evident. Nearby, detectives found a blood-stained blanket. In Michael's hand was a small silver bracelet, perhaps his only comfort as he endured his final, agonizing moments. Robert Boyd Rhodes was arrested after his truck became stuck in the mud, less than a kilometer from where Michael Lyons' body had been found. When deputies approached, he sat motionless in the driver's seat, shirtless, barefoot, and wearing soaked jeans. His strange calmness immediately struck the officers, but his presence near the crime scene made him a prime suspect. The truck had a tow cable tied to a tree, attached to a winch on the rear axle. On the tailgate, investigators found a serrated fishing knife. The blade carried bloodstains mixed with river mud. Later forensic testing confirmed the blood was Michael's. Detectives soon learned that Rhodes worked as a barber and lived in Sutter, a small town nearby. His face appeared on a statewide list of nearly 900 men previously convicted of crimes against minors. The list, compiled as a warning for the public, had little real effect in practice. Communities rarely knew who these men were or what dangers they posed. For Michael's family, his death destroyed everything. His mother, Sandy, described her son as a bright, good-natured 8-year-old who loved to help his teachers, make friends laugh, and look out for his sisters. After the murder, Sandy said she spent countless hours replaying the last 10 hours of Michael's life. Tormented by the thought of the pain he suffered, the loss nearly consumed the household. Billy, Michael's stepfather, began drinking heavily. Michael's younger sisters could not understand why their brother never came home. The youngest, 5-year-old Alesia, later remembered waiting on the porch for weeks, wrapped in Michael's Spider-Man blanket, hoping he would walk back from school. For Sandy, the day her son died, life as she knew it ended. Still, she eventually found a way to turn grief into purpose. Instead of allowing the tragedy to silence her, Sandy became active in child protection advocacy. She traveled to schools to warn children about dangers from strangers, organized community meetings, and lobbied for stronger penalties for violent offenders. She testified before lawmakers, joined rallies, and partnered with other families who had endured similar losses. Her work led to the founding of the Michael Lyons Foundation, which continues to educate parents and support victims' families. By that time, however, authorities had already tied Rhodes to other disturbing crimes. In 1985, just a year after Julie Connell's death, he broke into a woman's home, pointed a gun at her, handcuffed her to a pipe before abusing her. He then forced her into his truck, drove toward a river. The woman managed to leap out of the moving vehicle. When Rhodes tried to back up and run her over, she escaped into a nearby building. He was arrested and convicted of kidnapping and assault. Rhodes did not remain in prison for long. After his release, he reoffended. In 1993, he abused the 4-year-old granddaughter of a woman he was dating. That conviction, for lewd acts with a child, again put him on the radar of law enforcement, but once more he was eventually free. It wasn't until Michael Lyons' brutal murder in 1996 that he finally faced the full weight of justice. In 1990, Rhodes was sentenced to death for Michael's killing. 3 years later, in 2002, the DNA evidence collected from Julie Connell's body back in 1984 was tested again with improved technology. The sample matched Rhodes. It was the first clear forensic link between him and Julie's murder. Yet for prosecutors, this was not enough to guarantee a conviction. Defense attorneys could argue that the DNA only proved intimate contact, not murder, and they might claim it had been consensual. District Attorney Angela Backers knew she would need more. She dedicated herself to the case, going through every old file, photo, and statement, determined to build a case strong enough to bring justice for Julie Connell after nearly 2 decades. Her persistence finally paid off. District Attorney Angela Backers located one of Robert Boyd Rhodes' former girlfriends from 1984. The woman revealed 2 crucial details. At the time of Julie's disappearance, Rhodes had lived less than a block from Kennedy Park, and he drove a green truck. That piece of information led Angela to revisit old photographs collected from department store employees who had hosted an outdoor Easter party in the park on the day Julie vanished. With a magnifying glass in hand, she carefully examined each image in one blurry, low-resolution photo. She noticed a green truck parked near the edge of the park. A few meters from the vehicle, sitting on a blanket, was a young woman wearing a lavender shirt. Although the photo was unclear, Angela recognized her as Julie Connell. This image placed both the truck and Julie in the same frame and provided the missing connection investigators had been searching for. The new evidence gave prosecutors the confidence to charge Robert Boyd Rhodes with Julie Connell's murder. In 2007, 23 years after the crime, the case finally went to trial. By that point, Rhodes was already on death row for the murder of Michael Lyons. Prosecutors argued that after Julie finished studying in the park, she packed her belongings into her backpack and prepared to leave. Investigators believed Rhodes had been watching her from his truck, waiting for the right moment. He somehow persuaded her to come closer to his vehicle before grabbing her and forcing her inside. The defense, knowing that the DNA evidence was central to the case, tried to undermine its impact. Rhodes' attorney claimed that Rhodes and Julie had been in a consensual relationship. To support this claim, Rhodes' sister testified in court, saying she had seen them together and described them as a couple. The testimony deeply offended and angered Julie's family. They could not accept the idea that a disciplined, college-bound teenager would be romantically involved with a man like Rhodes, who had already shown a pattern of violent behavior. For them, the defense's argument was not only implausible but an insult to Julie's memory. The trial forced the Connells to relive the details of her last hours, an experience that was emotionally draining and painful. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision quickly. They deliberated for less than an hour before finding Robert Boyd Rhodes guilty of Julie Connell's murder. He was sentenced to death, making him one of the rare individuals in California to receive multiple death sentences. In the years since, Kennedy Park has carried a heavy significance. Once a lively place for families and children, it became a symbol of loss and remembrance. A memorial bench was placed there in Julie's honor, ensuring that her name would never be forgotten. For the Connells, the verdict brought some closure, but it could not erase the pain. Julie had been a daughter and a sister, someone full of promise. Her absence left a permanent hole in their lives. The Connell family's fight for justice shows the power of persistence. They refused to allow Julie's story to fade into the background. And after more than 2 decades, they finally saw accountability. Their journey is a reminder of how fragile life is and how determination can keep hope alive. Even when the odds seem impossible,